Chapter 454. 2 hours later, the small-eyed man on the hospital bed, the man who had been shoved into the legend because of his scandal with the nation's girl, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lo, finally woke up. In the dark of the night, on the lonely hospital bed, he opened his eyes. At first, he was confused, but after a moment of clarity, his eyes were as bright as yesterday. He looked down and found that his body was not missing any parts because of the last explosion. The stone in his heart fell to the ground with a thump. Therefore, he rejoiced and smiled happily. His neat teeth and bright smile were still clean and white, without a trace of the negative color of life and death on the battlefield. Rubbing his slightly swollen eyebrows, Su Lo looked at his watch to confirm the time. He began to observe his surroundings. He found himself in a messy medical room. It was quiet and no one came. The number of needles on the white prescription beside the hospital bed fell into his eyes. He could not help but be slightly stunned. Bluegrass anesthetic was a new type of anesthetic developed by the 11th Research Institute of the Federal Academy of Science in the 61st year of the constitutional era. Its effect was amazing, and it was safe and reliable. It could be added to all the beautiful television shopping terms. However, just like the fact that the federal military only developed 3 ACWs proved that too perfect a thing would naturally be too expensive. They actually used so much. Su Lo could not help but scratch his head. He wondered how generous the federal military was to the wounded. At the same time, he felt a bit of heartache. Then, he vaguely remembered that after returning to the camp, before the clear pain on the operating table turned into confusion, there seemed to be a medical officer who asked him to sign some form. Could it be a notice of critical illness? His injury was much more serious than he felt. Your injury is not serious. Bai Yulan pushed open the door and walked in. In her hand was a red Westwood serpent fruit. The water droplets on the fruit were clear. She passed the serpent fruit to Su Lo on the bed. She lowered her head and said softly, when the last wolf tongue exploded, "Fortunately, your nerve reaction speed was faster than others. You threw De Xiong and De Lin far away and jumped up yourself. But you were still injured. The bulletproof boots were completely destroyed, and the muscles in your calf were torn." Su Lo took the serpent fruit and took a bite. He said, "Then I should be fine soon. How is the situation in the group?" In the words of the medical team, this time, Group 7's luck was so good that it defied the natural order. Many were injured, but not a single one was sacrificed. Su Li's fingers that were holding the serpent fruit were slightly startled, and he silently smiled. Immediately, he felt that today's white magnolia seemed to be a little different from usual. Although she was as gentle as usual, there was always a trace of autumn dryness in her tone. He did not understand why, but he was too lazy to think about it. He closed his eyes tiredly and began to review the course of this sudden battle. He thought about the calmness and tacit cooperation displayed by the veterans of Group 7 above the meadow. He thought about Xiong Linchuan's splitting of the gun and Gu Shifeng's terrifyingly accurate electric control methods. He could not help but sigh. After today, I finally understand that the Group 7 you brought up is indeed very fierce. No wonder the government had all those secret jobs that could not see the light of day and let you guys do them. Bai Yulan was silent. She was silent again and again. Finally, she broke the silence and said to Su Lo in an extremely serious tone, "I don't want what happened on the battlefield today to happen again. Is this an order?" Su Lo opened his eyes. It was rare to hear a maid or secretary speak in such a tone. He could not help but feel that it was somewhat interesting. There are 18 veterans in Group 7, including me. They are all people with experience and ability on the battlefield. Lon Xiaolong is also a wastrel. Boss, in the future, you need to learn to trust us on the battlefield. Although the Empire's light armored squad is indeed a little troublesome, we can still handle it. What is required on the battlefield is teamwork and teamwork. It is impossible to expect you to jump out and wear your underwear to play the role of a superhero every time there is a battle. You are a human, not a mecha. Any stray bullet could have taken your life. The fact that you were able to survive today only shows that you were lucky. Su-Lut scratched his head again. He thought to himself that the superhero character in Master Schiller's early dramas was clearly not human. How could he be so fierce? Bai Yulan continued, furthermore, since you temporarily gave me the command authority, you had to listen to my orders. Before I gave you clear instructions, you jumped out. This kind of personal heroism, other than being able to kill people and give the cameraman of the Venus documentary film studio a source of excitement, has no other use. Su-Lo was silent for a moment. Then, he smiled and said, but in fact, you and I both know that in the situation at that time, there was no other way except for me to jump out. You and I know that you will never be able to order me to jump out, so I had to jump out myself. Bai Yulan was silent again. She used her fingers to tidy up the fluttering hair on her forehead. I know myself very well. I am only suitable to be a small soldier. Su-Lo looked at her and said seriously, Group 7 has more than 100 people. If I want more people to return alive, I can only trust your command, but you must also treat me as an ordinary soldier and command me. Bai Yulan shook her head and said with an unquestionable tone, no. You will be a teacher, a general, or even a marshal in the future. You must learn to command on the battlefield and have the courage to do so. Su-Lo knew what to say. He silently placed the serpent fruit on the bedside table. Commanding on the battlefield may be an art, but in many specific combat situations, commanding was the art of killing. Not only did one have to kill the enemy, but they also had to kill one's own people and let one's subordinates carry out certain death missions. And this was a mentality that he could understand, but it was difficult for him to achieve. The base, which had been silent for a long time, suddenly erupted with loud cheers. Su-Lo looked at Bai Yulan with a puzzled expression. Bai Yulan took out a red serpent fruit from somewhere and wiped it with a snow-white handkerchief. She softly explained, just now, everyone in the base was watching the live broadcast of the battle on the Federation's news channel. Where is it from? Su-Lo asked. 5460. Bai Yulan said, 2 hours ago, 5 mechanists began to attack Glacier Stronghold in the Northern Hemisphere. Judging from the cheers, they probably made a decisive breakthrough. Then, she added in a serious tone, the main vanguard is Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division. Su-Lo opened his mouth slightly and sighed in disbelief. They even dare to broadcast a military operation live. Those big shots in the Department of Defense are too confident in Du Shaoqing. Do they really think that this person will never lose? In fact, the Iron 7th Division has already fought 6 tough battles and won all of them, Bai Yulan replied. Su-Lo was silent. He thought of the conversation with Bai Yulan and the so-called art of commanding. He naturally thought of Commander Du Shaoqing, who always wore sunglasses and dared to treat the lives of soldiers as numbers. However, the soldiers under this person were also willing to do those boring numbers for him. This was the terrifying part about him. Many people in the army knew about the rumors of Zhong Laohu suppressing Du Shaoqing. Not long after the war with the dynasty started, 2 generals from the West Woods military were severely punished by the Department of Defense for not being able to reinforce the Iron 7th Division in time. This only added to the authenticity of the rumors. Most of the Federation's main forces attacking the 3 fallen planets were from the West Woods military. More than 80% of the soldiers in the rhombus-shaped base on Planet 163 were from the West Woods. Naturally, they did not have a good impression of Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division. However, they were all soldiers of the Federation after all. Watching the live broadcast of the first military operation in history, watching the inexplicably exciting battle scenes, watching their compatriots crush the defense line the dynasty had set up in the dangerous glaciers inch by inch, they still cheered for each other from the bottom of their hearts. The light screen gradually turned dark. The soldiers of the Federation discussed excitedly before they returned to their own barracks and began to prepare for the battle that might come tomorrow morning, or perhaps later at night. Outside the barracks in the southwest corner, the 100 old soldiers from the 7th Division found it difficult to immerse themselves in such a crude and simple emotional reaction. They looked ahead with complicated gazes, at the veterans who were talking and laughing, and subconsciously looked at their wounded troops and the boxes of biological materials wrapped in them. Their mood was low, but there was also an inexplicable change. These precious young masters from the capital ring, on their first mission and first battlefield, encountered the rumored ferocious people of the Imperium, and encountered a sudden battle. In fact, many people, including the bodybuilders, were so scared that they could not even eat dinner. Although these old soldiers were not scared to the point of peeing their pants, there were countless people like Sheeping who could not tell north from south in the smoke. Well done. Xiong Linquan, whose voice was loud and clear, walked back with his cane and slapped the back of a recruit's head hard. He laughed and said, "You actually dared to stay at that time. You have guts." When he escaped in the end, he was already on the verge of collapse, and he was caught by Su Lu. Then, he played a toss game in the end and narrowly escaped death. However, judging from his mood right now, he did not seem to be affected by the matter of life and death at all. The recruit who was slapped hard by him was Yen Bingyen. When they retreated on the meadow today, he bravely stayed and formed the last line of defense with the veterans of the 7th Division. Although he did not kill a single person of the Imperium, the feeling filled his heart with a solid aftertaste. Now that he was slapped hard by Xiong Linquan, he was a little confused. When he heard the other party's praise, he could only chuckle. Along the row of barracks, Xiong Linquan slapped one head after another. It was as if he was testing the ripeness of a watermelon. As he slapped, he praised loudly. However, those who were slapped by him did not have any trace of shame on their faces. Instead, they laughed foolishly like Yen Bingyen, because being slapped meant that they had bravely dragged on until the end today. Xiong Linquan stood in front of the crowd. Suddenly, his expression turned serious and he said seriously, "You guys did not retreat first today. You have guts and courage, but you will have to listen to military orders in the future. After all, you are all rookies, and it will not be useful to stay there. On the battlefield, the old will lead the new, and the dead will lead the living. Once you have been trained, there will be plenty of time for you to put your lives on the line. At that time, this old bear may have to count on you guys to save my life. Do you understand?" The rookies were stunned for a long time before they reacted. Some of them replied loudly, "Understood." Chapter 455. Not everyone was in the mood to respond to Xiong Linquan's boorish attitude. Shipeng, Zhongxiang, and a few other important people's young masters sat in the shadows in the corner. They avoided the strange moon above their heads and silently watched everything. Occasionally, they would lower their eyes. Shipeng's face was a bit haggard and pale. Today, he was almost killed by the people of the Empire in the meadow. It was all thanks to Su Li's slap that he fell to the ground, that he luckily escaped with his life. Right now, when he recalled the dangerous scene, his body was still cold. He used his fingers to rub off the dried mud on his face. He lowered his head and spat out a mouthful of saliva. "Give me a cigarette." Zhongxiang was slightly surprised. He turned around and went into the room. He took out a few boxes of cigarettes wrapped in pure white paper. After tearing them open, he gave one to Shipeng. He held one in his mouth and threw the remaining boxes to his companions beside him. Smoke curled up in the night. A few red dots of light flickered in and out. Other than the occasional unaccustomed coughing, there was no other sound. No matter if they were born with a golden spoon in their mouth, a silver coin in their hand, or soil in their hands, as long as they entered the frontline battlefield and saw the real life and death around them, the young soldiers would begin to smoke, even if they were once staunch supporters of the Quit Smoking campaign. This was a cigarette specially provided by the Logistics Department of the Ministry of National Defense. There was no symbol on the white cigarette box or the cigarette itself. The specially provided cigarette contained mellowness within the spiciness. It was not bad. However, Shipeng and the other young masters would never smoke something of this level before. However, today, for some reason, as they coughed and inhaled fiercely, they felt that this kind of spicy knife-like taste was really good. Shipeng grabbed the butt and lit a second cigarette. It was not until his lungs were a bit sore from the smoke that he finally shook off the fear of the day. He furrowed his brows slightly. He looked at the room in the distance that was covered by the light but filled with the thick smell of tobacco. He thought of the slap he received in the meadow and thought of Lieutenant Colonel Su, who was about the same age as him. No matter what this guy was thinking, he at least fulfilled the promise he made before the battle. He was the last one to leave. 5 days later, the night before the 7th Combat Team's second mission was still as silent and peaceful as the previous few nights. It was like a quiet night in a mountain village. One could faintly hear the sound of running water in the distance. Unfortunately, there were no golden wild rice fields around the base. On the training ground in front of the barracks, dozens of soldiers were working hard to learn how to operate some special precision tools and firearms. According to the arrangement in the manual, they were divided into several groups. Some groups held heavy manual air pressure valves and worked hard to dig into the ground. Some groups had to assemble various electronic parts according to the procedures in the shortest amount of time and then put them into the small holes about 3 meters deep. Some groups carried out band monitoring and signal mixing and annihilation work, and some groups were responsible for the final disguise of the ground. A middle-aged man with curly hair stood in front of the barracks. Through the infantry communication system in his hand, he issued specific orders and operation corrections to the various groups. This was one of the most important tasks for the federal military on the 3 fallen planets. Under the watchful eyes of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, they had to quietly rebuild the electronic surveillance network so that the light of the charter could cover as much ground as possible as soon as possible. From time to time, a slight tremor could be heard from the ground, followed by low and concise calls. Although the cooperation between the teams was still a little rusty, their speed was clearly getting faster and faster. In order to infiltrate the no-man's land between the Federation and the Imperium to install the electronic surveillance network, the most important thing was secrecy and speed. It's probably because of what happened in the meadow that day that these princelings were stimulated. They now know what they have to do to survive. Bai Yulan stood beside Su Lu and said softly, from the second day onwards, they began to consciously increase their training. Of course, these kids are most concerned about firearms. De Xiong is now the most popular person in the military camp. Su Lu smiled and lowered his head to look at the technical manual in his hand. In the past 5 days, he had been busy communicating with his colleagues in the Nutshell Engineering Department far away in the capital ring about how to use the micro-turbine in the mecha. He also needed to master the extremely complicated technical procedures of the Bureau of Proclamation, so he really did not notice that the attitude of the recruits in Group 7 had changed. After putting away the technical manual, he glanced at the middle-aged official in front of the team. This person was a technical official specially assigned by the Bureau of Proclamation. He was in charge of guiding the installation and debugging of the charter network. Group 7 wanted to complete their mission, so they had to ensure this person's arrangement. Last time, when they retreated from the meadow, Bai Yulan also did not hesitate to arrange for this Bureau of Proclamation official to leave first. Seeing this silent Bureau of Proclamation official, he naturally thought of the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation and the Federal Central Computer under the Bureau of Proclamation. The Federation had made a great decision to reinstall the surveillance network. The Bureau of Proclamation had invested a lot of manpower and resources. Just on Planet 163 alone, there were many teams like Group 7 that were risking their lives to do this work. Once the various node areas were connected into a network, the glory of the Charter would return to the border planets, and the end of the Imperial Expeditionary Force would come. For Sulu personally, this matter had another important meaning, and that was that he could once again maintain contact with the old man with a mechanical mind and a human face. Thinking of this, he said to the existence in his mind, "Tomorrow, I have to help you reattach your severed limb. How do you feel?" A line of white words appeared in his left eye from the central computer. The Bureau of Proclamation's terminology is planting mushrooms. Sulu almost laughed out loud. Tomorrow's mission will depart at 6 in the evening and will probably return in the wee hours of the morning. Let's move forward at night. The mid-range missiles that pose the greatest threat to the Imperium probably won't appear. It's just that our network is seriously damaged right now, so we can only rely on the shortwave GPS in our hands to locate the target area. Bai Yulan saw that his silent expression was a little strange. Thinking that he was worried about the mission tomorrow, she explained a few words. Too bad we can't use mechas. Sulu came back to his senses and shook his head. We can't let the Empire discover any traces, so we can't bring any heavy equipment. Our small groups are like little girls planting mushrooms in the dark. How long will it take to fill this planet with mushrooms? Bai Yulan looked at him with a strange expression. Looking at Su Li's serious expression, she confirmed that he really did not know about the famous erotic joke, so she could only lower her head. Although those extremely expensive drugs were approved by the medical officer in exchange for my signature, I still find it very strange. The equipment and supplies of this remote rhombus-shaped base seem to be much better than expected. Sulu turned his head to look at Bai Yulan and said, "Also, the air support on the meadow that day, don't you think it was a little strange?" "It was indeed strange," Bai Yulan replied succinctly. The fighter support that day came very timely. It even felt like it was a little too timely. Those all-terrain fighter jets seemed to be wandering in the stratosphere, not caring about wasting energy at all. They were just waiting for us to cause trouble. It's not that they were waiting for us to cause trouble, but that the command center dared not let us cause trouble. Sulu said calmly, "It's not just a matter of time." For a combat team that just reached 100 members, the command center actually sent over a dozen fighter jets. If the Federation really had such a luxurious combat ratio, why would the Bureau of Proclamation officials be so worried? They could just send the fighter jets and mechas over and flatten those Empire people's fortifications. It seems like there are people above us. Bai Yulan raised her head and looked at the night sky. The dark blue sky was filled with stars, but they were not dense. She thought with a calm expression, the President, the War God, the Minister of Defense, they were all people above Little Boss. As if guessing what she was thinking, Sulu smiled bitterly and said, "I don't think the Ministry of Defense's arrangement is against me. In my opinion, it's the President who doesn't want these old soldiers to really die." Bai Yulan was silent for a moment, then nodded. Group 7 came to the most dangerous planet in the West Woods border, Fallen Star, not only because of the needs of the war itself, but also because of the political needs of the capital ring. President Pobre stood on the side of the people and sent these young masters to the front line to be bathed in blood. But if these young masters were really covered in blood and suffered heavy casualties, what would the anger of the upper echelons of the Federation twist the world into? Our mission period is at least 3.5 months. Bai Yulan turned to look at Sulu and said seriously, "On the battlefield, the Ministry of Defense can't really send a squadron of fighter jets to babysit those young masters every day. We still have to be careful. Okay. Sulo looked at the serious expression of the recruits not far away. Looking at their increasingly skillful operation, he felt a faint sense of heaviness in his heart. He said, although I don't like these young masters, I don't want to see them die. But in fact, there will definitely be people who will fall. Maybe that will include you and me. In the night, this young man from Donglin had a rare moment of emotion in his life, but he was interrupted by a microphone that was passed to him. A reporter from the Ministry of Defense's Venus documentary film studio looked at Sulo curiously and asked in a low voice, Lieutenant Colonel Sulo, regarding the second mission that will begin tomorrow, do you have any thoughts? I noticed that you have been watching the training of the recruits. Did you also notice the changes in their emotions these past few days? Do you think these changes can really transform into combat strength? Seeing this reporter and the cameraman behind him, Sulo quickly put on his sunglasses, frowned slightly, and said seriously, my idea is that if you can stop following us every day, then these recruits should have a much higher chance of surviving. These were his heartfelt words. Under the strict orders of the Ministry of Defense, Group 7 could not get rid of this extremely simplified cameraman. During the battle, they still had to take care of these two non-combatants, which really made him and the veterans of Group 7 extremely unhappy. Also, don't forget the three-party agreement between Nutshell Headquarters, Venus Documentary Film Studio, and the Federation News Channel. Sulo pushed the camera lens to the side and said, without my permission, no footage can be broadcast. I can understand this, but I don't understand why you refused the news channel's request for a live broadcast. This military reporter was very clear about the influence of the young lieutenant colonel in front of him, but he still did not understand why he refused such an excellent opportunity. Sulo did not answer this question. He turned around and left. In his heart, he silently thought that he was not the invincible Du Shaoqing. He was just a combat director with the rank of lieutenant colonel. More importantly, people always died in war. It should not be filmed into something like a TV series for people to watch, get excited, scream, or grieve. Chapter 456. My name is Xiao Shizenlu. I'm 24 years old from Maine. My father is a worker at the Federation's three-dimensional irrigation farm. My mother. She stays at home all year round on government subsidies. I also have a younger sister who is in high school this year. Why is he called that? Because when my mother gave birth to me in the hospital, my father was watering the 13th floor of the farm, controlling the speed of the water droplets. I forgot to mention that this is the only job he has ever done in his life. He has spent most of his life on the 13th floor of the farm. On the TV screen, a young man with a dark complexion was talking to the camera. There was a hint of panic in his calm eyes. His skin was rough due to the torment of the strong winds and rays on planet Shilin. Coupled with the crumpled cigarette between his dry lips and the light infantry uniform on his body, it fully displayed the image of a simple frontline soldier. You don't know how many floors there are in the irrigation farm. The soldier looked at the camera in surprise and scratched his head in confusion. He then laughed and said, "It's normal that you city people don't know about this." A voice outside the camera asked, "What do you want to say to the government or the Senate about your mother's situation of being unemployed for many years?" Xiao Shizenlu simply shook his head and said to the camera, "The government provides subsidies. Besides, I've been receiving quite a lot of subsidies over the years. My family's life is not a problem. My best weapon is the 21-26 long-range sniper rifle, but there are at least 3 people in our group who use it better than me. Lao Bai, De Xiong. Lieutenant Colonel Sulo. I've never seen him use a sniper rifle, but I heard that it's awesome. I saw him play with the Cayenne light machine in battle. He must be awesome with a sniper rifle as well. There was no such thing as awesome in the Federation. The word awesome was automatically muted by the news channel. The mission is indeed a bit tiring. We've been on this crappy planet for more than a month and have only fought 1.5 battles. It's really boring, Xiao Shizenlut said seriously. Of course, we all know that once we encounter the enemy of the Empire, if we are not well prepared, it will really be fatal. The camera was slightly tilted up at his dusty and tired face. Behind him was a messy bush. From the angle of the camera, the person holding the camera should be lying on the ground. This might be a break in the battle. You know that our mission is top secret. Then why ask? Is there a problem? I finally understand why Boss and Lao Bai hate you guys so much. After a period of self-expression, 13th floor gradually got used to the feeling of facing the camera. The 7 groups of ruffians that were previously hidden by his simple and honest appearance finally revealed a little. All right. He waved his hand angrily at the camera and said, I knew I had to answer. Beep, beep, beep. If I had known, I wouldn't have made that bet last night. Lu Jiao and those bastards insisted that I accept your interview. Yes, I have been in the army for many years. I am a veteran. What do you think of these new recruits? I have no opinion. That's right, this brat is now in the same dorm as me. You're asking me about my relationship with him. 13th Wang glanced to the left of the camera and smiled mockingly. These new recruits are much stronger than before. What I don't like the most about this kid is that he loves to bathe too much. He is clearly a man, yet he makes himself smell good all day. The camera shifted to the left, and a young man's face that was distorted due to anger entered the camera. After seeing the camera, the young man panicked and quickly said, Don't film me, don't film me. The camera didn't move away. Unable to win against the persistence of the camera, the young man had no choice. After a moment of silence, he angrily explained, I only bathe once every 3 days. The frequency has decreased a lot. I don't understand why these old soldiers don't care about personal hygiene. What I care about is being alive. 13th floor's disdainful voice came from outside the camera. My name is Da Vinci. The new recruit was silent for a moment. A slight smile rose to his face. I am 22 years old this year. Yes, my father is the governor of Xisha State, De Qingren. I am now in the same dorm as the guy you just interviewed. Why did you choose this name? After mother stopped performing at Xisha Theater, she fell in love with painting. On the day she gave birth to me, my father happened to be working at an excavation site before the catastrophe. Yes, it was the discovery that shocked the Federation 20 years ago. My father saw the archaeologists take out a pile of chains and watermelon knives with Da Vinci's name on them from the basement. Just wait. Junk, so he decided to name me Da Vinci. Da Vinci said with some sadness. Afterwards, it was proven that this was just another prank by Master Schiller. The voice outside the camera laughed and said, but this in itself is very valuable. Da Vinci chuckled and took a cigarette from 13th floor's hand. He lit it and said, yes. After being on the front lines for more than a month, do you feel any different? The voice outside the camera asked. Da Vinci seriously thought for a long time. He took a deep drag on the cigarette and said, the freedom and peace of the Federation require blood and sacrifice. This isn't a cliché, it's a real feeling. What do you think of these old soldiers? Well, they taught us a lot, not just combat skills. The governor's son shrugged. And to be honest, without them, we might have died very easily. The weapon I'm best at. That must be DI, he said excitedly. However, it was a pity that this young master had spent countless nights mastering the manual air pressure valve. Because of the need to keep it a secret, he was forced to end up in the same pitiful state as the old soldier beside him. I can't accept that 13th floor doesn't wash his feet. His feet are very smelly. The sterile socks issued by the Ministry of Defense can't remove the smell. Da Vinci said seriously. Then, he extended a fist outside the camera and hit him hard on the forehead. He rubbed his forehead, looked at the camera, and laughed. And 13th floor has a life dream that makes people want to vomit. As he said this, he forcefully pulled 13th floor's hand away from his mouth and said loudly, he wants to be a general, but he doesn't even look at himself. The camera turned to 13th floor again. The soldier's face, which was red with anger, immediately became very serious. He said to the person behind the camera, "You also think that the son of a farmer can't be a general?" There was no answer. Isn't President Pobre the son of a miner in Donglin? 13th floor spat out a mouthful of saliva with the smell of tobacco. He laughed and said, "Besides, my boss will definitely be a marshal in the future. What's the point of me being a general and then retiring?" The camera was obviously frightened by this arrogant declaration and turned to Da Vinci. "Is there anything you want to say to your family?" Da Vinci was already prepared. He smiled brightly at the camera and said, "Dad, Mom, don't worry about me." Suddenly, the smile gradually disappeared. The arrogant and childish face of the young master became more dignified and steady. He said slowly, "We will do well on the front line. Also, my dear Shirong, you have to wait for me to come back." The battlefield scene in the camera was gradually painted with a halo of homesickness. Just as some kind of warm thoughts were surging, 13th floor's dark face suddenly squeezed into the camera and said, "Governor, if I can't become a general, you have to find me a good job for the sake of taking care of your son." The expression on Da Vinci's face became very interesting. He pushed and kicked this guy out of the camera. Who knew that at this time, 13th floor looked at him seriously and said, "I remember that your parents and your fiancé would never allow you to smoke." Da Vinci, who had a cigarette in his thin lips, was stunned. His face was a little pale. He felt that the cigarette between his lips was like a thin and hot iron. His lips trembled and the cigarette butt fell into the mud. A hand quickly covered the camera, leaving behind endless aftertaste for the hundreds of millions of viewers watching with relish in front of the TV. "My name is Xiong Lin Quan. I come from the small town of Greenbow County in the 37th state. I don't know where it is. If you don't know, can't you check it out? Why do you care how old I am? I can use any gun. These little bastards. Well, they are really good. At least they are much better than I thought. My name is Song Xiang. I come from the university town of Linhai State. I am 21 years old this year. Does my father's identity have anything to do with our battle on the front line? Well, he is indeed the president of Yue University. My name is Bai Yulan, and then, that's it. My name is Shipeng. I was urgently called to the front line 71 days ago. At that time, no one knew the specific mission orders. The faces of the veterans and the new recruits kept appearing in the camera. It was obvious that the footage was not taken at the same time and place. After spending some time on the front line and experiencing the baptism of smoke and blood, it was difficult to distinguish the two completely different types of people from their appearance and temperament. However, whether it was the Venus Documentary Film Studios filmmakers or the hundreds of millions of viewers in front of the TV, after watching for a while, they could easily distinguish between the two types of people. The eyes of the veterans of Group 7 were even colder and more ruthless. There was also a kind of frivolous indifference. More importantly, in their short self-introduction, there were even more profanities and curses than the new recruits. Countless muted beeps that represented silencing entered thousands of households in a manner that created a broadcast record for the Federation's news channel. It shook the eardrums of many people. A burning cloud suddenly floated across the camera. Bullets whistled past, hitting the bodies of Federation soldiers. Some soldiers fell, dirt was kicked up, and there were angry and hurried shouts and even more beeps. The camera began to shake violently. It was like the handheld camera technique that some movie directors deliberately use to create the atmosphere of a battlefield. However, all of this was real. There was not much blood that burst out, but it was particularly dazzling. The sounds of explosions were not really ear-splitting, but it seemed to make people feel the earth tremble. After 3 seconds of fading in and out, the camera returned to the military base. After the frantic medical treatment, it returned to the peace after the battle. This was a dusk that was as red as blood. The voiceover used a deliberately calm tone to slowly narrate everything that this team had experienced. The soldiers of Group 7, some of them came from poor families, some came from rich families, but they all had a common goal, for the victory of the Federation, so they had to walk together. In the first episode, we once showed everyone the anger and conflict that was hidden in the beginning of this unit. However, a month and a half later, it seemed that some very wonderful and very good things were happening in this unit. We are very curious. If these very good things were happening in every corner of our society, what kind of positive power would that bring? This is the second episode of the Federation News Channel's documentary Group 7. Thank you for watching. In the next episode, we will strive to have the highest commander of this unit, who has never spoken, talk about his legendary experiences and war stories. The camera focused on a figure in the twilight military base, and then gradually faded into darkness. Chapter 457. Amidst the swirling smoke, Sulo narrowed his eyes and sucked hard on the cigarette between his lips. He said vaguely but with an exceptionally firm tone, "Even if you beat me to death, I will not go on camera and perform like these guys. What the hell is this? And that guy on the 13th floor, is there something wrong with his head?" He shouted in front of the entire Federation that he wants to be a marshal. In the dimly lit room, the TV screen was playing the end of the Federation's most popular reality documentary recently. The somewhat familiar figure in the twilight made Su Li's cheeks heat up. He did not understand how the cameraman had managed to capture the feeling of desolation when he was in a daze. He was even more annoyed by the way the cameraman had pretended to be lonely and imitated despair. Xiong Linquan chuckled and took a big gulp of the strong tea from the plastic pot in front of him. He pressed the remote control to change the channel and said, "I think it's pretty good." Beside him, Magnolia Bai also smiled and said, "Actually, with such a camera crew in the team, sometimes it can really adjust the atmosphere." However, after shooting for so long, in the end, only one episode can be filmed. "I heard that the head of the Ministry of Defense's propaganda department and the news channel have a lot of opinions about you." Sulo licked his lips, lowered his head and flicked the ash from his cigarette. He chuckled and said, "This is an agreement that was reached beforehand. Don't worry too much about it. I think their main headache is that you have to wear sunglasses before you are willing to appear on camera, and that you are unwilling to accept a direct interview," Lon Xiaolong said with a shrug. Su Luk shook his head, pushed open the door, and walked out. The fresh air of the military camp flowed in with the wind, making him feel refreshed. In the barracks, the soldiers of Group 7 were gathered in groups. Like Su Lo and the other officers, they had just finished watching the documentary. For many of them, when they first appeared on TV, they attached great importance to their own documentary. At this moment, many of them were reminiscing about how they looked on the camera and regretting that they spoke foolishly. From time to time, there would be bursts of laughter in the crowd. Further away, in the barracks of the ground team, Da Vinci and Xiao Shi-san were having an exaggerated argument, which then turned into a wrestling match. In the end, without any suspense, the son of the governor was pressed down heavily by the son of the farmer, tossing and turning in pain. Looking at this scene, Su Lo couldn't help but scratch his head and laugh. The anger he felt when watching the TV disappeared without a trace. The broadcast of the documentary series Iron 7 was another important move by the President's Office, the Ministry of National Defense, and the Federation News Channel, after the unprecedented live broadcast of the Iron 7 Division's military operations. Unlike the previous live broadcast of the Northern Expedition on Planet 5460, this series of documentaries focused on the lives of the frontline troops and some specific details. The complexity of the composition of Group 7, as well as the natural conflict between the fierce civilian veterans and the noble young recruits, naturally had some kind of inherent drama tension. After the first episode of the documentary series, Iron 7, was broadcast, it immediately received the attention of the people of the Federation. While easily winning high ratings, it also sparked a heated discussion among the people on the capital planet. For the people living on the Peace Planet, it was the first time they had a close understanding of the specific days in the military camp. They were curious about the negative effects of the social class differences in the troops. Tonight was the second episode. At this time, more than 2 months had passed since Group 7 arrived on Planet 163, and more than 20 days had passed since the Venus documentary film studio finished filming. It was believed that after tonight, there would be a heated discussion in the entire Federation. As the person involved, as the commanding officer of Group 7, and as the person who specifically manipulated the will of the Federation government, Sulu understood better than anyone else the deep meaning of this series of documentaries. The President and the military needed to use Group 7's movie-like experience on the frontline to suppress the protests of some anti-war activists and to mend the huge gap between the rich and poor in the Federation. Based on this understanding, Sulu had never been enthusiastic about this matter. It was just a theatrical performance for the political needs of the Federation. No matter how he looked at it, there was always a sense of unhappiness. But today, seeing the excited reactions of the members in the military camp, his attitude changed a little. He stood on the stairs and quietly watched the veterans and recruits mingling together. He felt a little satisfied. Dozens of days of life and death together on the battlefield could indeed change a lot. This kind of complete trust of entrusting one's back and life to one's companions could even change the attitude of many people for life, just like how Bai Yulan sighed with emotion after the end of the first mission. Although the members of Group 7 had special identities, the President and the Department of Defense could not really send countless iron soldiers to babysit these over 100 people. But perhaps there was something in the unseen world that was protecting this group that carried too many missions and meanings. Perhaps the creator of the constellation could not bear to see this nominally mercenary group become a tragic symbol under the eyes of hundreds of millions of people in the Federation. Group 7 had been on Planet 163 for 2.5 months, and had carried out 11 Bureau of Proclamation missions. But miraculously, no one died. Only 6 recruits and 1 unlucky veteran who stepped on an anti-infantry mine buried by the Empire beside the Shy Tree were sent back to the main planet of the West Woods by the warship because their injuries were too serious. Among the 7 wounded, 4 of them had to be amputated. On the battlefield, someone could die at any time, but none of Group 7 was willing to die. These injuries and losses could not bring sadness to the team. On the contrary, because they felt the threat of death together, but no one really died, everyone in Group 7 was in an extremely harmonious atmosphere. "Good morning, Supervisor." "Good morning, Supervisor." In the corner of the living area of the military camp, the soldiers who did not sit on the chairs but insisted on squatting by the training ground were laughing and talking about yesterday's television. Suddenly, they saw 2 people walking towards them. They immediately sprung up like springs, saluted, and greeted them loudly. But their left hands were still holding lunch boxes, and some of them had their mouths full of food, making them look especially funny. Sulu, who was wearing sunglasses, shook his head helplessly. He glanced at the film crew not far away and thought, if this continues, these soldiers in Group 7 will become natural comedians. According to military discipline, the soldiers who saluted by the roadside should respectfully call him, sir. But for some reason, when Sulu heard the word, sir, he felt chills all over his body. His hair stood on end, and when he straightened his collar, he also felt a cold wind blowing at the back of his neck. After queuing up and taking his meal, Sulu sat at the table under the sunlight and ate the standard meal consisting of 3 green vegetables, 5 servings of nutritious paste, a spoonful of rice, and a small string of salted vegetables. There was not a trace of disgust in his straight eyebrows. The soldiers in Group 7 subconsciously sat around him. No one dared to disturb him, but no one was willing to be too far away from him. He was like the center of a circle that did not know what to say. But because of a special trait that was difficult to describe with words, he attracted a lot of things around him. Probably only the soldiers in Group 7 could clearly describe what this special trait was. It was Su Li's brave and steady performance in every battle. It was because he saved the lives of many people, and it was because of his silent nature. At this time, a commotion suddenly erupted outside the living area. The team members who were eating turned their heads in shock and saw that under a wild tree, the delicate Gu Shifeng was arguing angrily with the curly-haired technical officer from the Bureau of Proclamation. Gu Shifeng was the best electronic technician in Group 7. All of the command and control system maintenance work was done by him. Group 7 was carrying out the Bureau of Proclamation's task of reconstructing the network on Planet 163, so he naturally had to represent Group 7 and cooperate with the technical officer from the Bureau of Proclamation. But for some reason, the usually calm Gu Shifeng was actually so angry. Sulu looked in that direction and put down the plastic spoon in his hand. He asked in confusion, "What's going on?" In the previous missions, the Bureau of Proclamation would always arrive at the target area before giving us the technical specifications and parameters. For the team members, not only do they have to avoid the eyes of the Empire's people, but they also have to take over at the last minute. This is too difficult. Bai Yulan glanced at him and explained, "This matter was mentioned in the last meeting. You asked Gu Shifeng to contact the Bureau of Proclamation official and try to obtain the specifications and parameters in advance. I think the other party's reaction will be very intense." Sulu nodded and looked in that direction quietly. With his extraordinary hearing, he clearly heard the words of the Bureau of Proclamation official. The Bureau of Proclamation official used confidentiality rules to coldly reject Group 7's request, but what really made Gu Shifeng angry was that the Bureau of Proclamation showed no regard for the lives of the team members. In the social structure of the Federation, the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation was always at the top. Somewhere in the clouds, the officials who served the Bureau of Proclamation naturally had an unpleasant sense of superiority and indifference. Su Li's eyebrows furrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything in the end. He just lowered his head and continued to eat. When Gu Shifeng walked into the cafeteria angrily, he gave her a comforting smile. He knew very well in his heart that a detached but extremely mechanical and bureaucratic organization like the Bureau of Proclamation, for the dozens of teams like Group 7 on this planet, was truly an unparalleled weapon that would make friends happy. However, even though he was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation, in front of the Bureau of Proclamation, he still didn't have much power to speak. Under the gaze of the members of Group 7, he put down his plate and walked in front of the curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official. After a moment of silence, he said in an extremely serious tone, "The Bureau of Proclamation has its rules, and the army has its traditions. Since you are not willing to temporarily give up on those ridiculous confidentiality rules for the sake of the survival of your soldiers, then I must remind you that if my people pay the price of unnecessary casualties because of your stupidity and conservatism, I will seek justice from Director C." The official looked at Sulu calmly. He didn't back down at all because of this threat, nor did he show any fear because he mentioned Director C. He was just as cold and rigid as the Federal Central Computer. Chapter 458. Cold and stubborn, like a stone thrown into the depths of Glacier 5460. Sulu was not unfamiliar with this personality. After leaving Donglin, he had met many people like this. He had made some guesses about the personality of the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation official, but he did not expect such a cold and stubborn official with absolute power to be able to remain so calm and silent in the past few days of work. He was so calm and silent that he did not even have a sense of existence. Until this sunny lunchtime, Sulo was shocked to find that he still could not remember the name of the person. It can't be a robot, right? He looked at the curly hair on the Bureau of Proclamation official's post with a bitter smile. There seemed to be no better way to deal with such a stubborn person other than to turn around and prepare for the mission in the afternoon. After lunch, the members of Team 7 who were already used to the mission process skillfully organized their light equipment and firearms. They divided into 2 teams, walked out of the gate of the military camp, and drove toward the relay base in military vehicles. The simple road outside the military camp was filled with all kinds of vehicles. On the hills in the distance, there were heavy military M52 mechas slowly moving forward. The speed of the fleet was much slower than usual. Sulu sat in the passenger seat and said worriedly, "Is the general attack about to begin?" But the progress of laying the net is still a long way off. Since 6 days ago, the Federal fleet suspended in the space of Planet 163 began to send combat personnel and heavy equipment to the ground at a frequency that was several times faster than normal. For a few nights in a row, the sky was brightly lit by the lights of the heavy transport ships. Under the cover of the fierce aerial firepower, at least 7 mechanists landed in various areas of the planet. Team 7 stopped at the side of the road and made way for the multi-axle heavy truck in front of them. The team members looked at the missile on top of the heavy truck in silence. They were slightly excited, but also a little nervous. The West Woods Military District is under too much pressure. The ground military operations of Planet 163 and Planet 3320 have been stagnant for more than 2 months. The Federation Parliament has been impatient for a long time, and the President can't let Commander Zhong drag this out forever. Bai Yulan lit a cigarette and continued, "This is a Hurricane 2 missile. The missile base behind the mountain should be on standby. The general attack will not be later than this week. Why are you in such a hurry?" Su Lu agreed and sighed. With so many groups laying the net, the longer the net is laid, the more protection the soldiers will have during the general attack. They can't bring it forward because of political pressure. Bai Yulan took a puff of her cigarette and sighed softly. They were just ordinary members of the army and couldn't influence the overall battle situation. More than a dozen multi-axle heavy trucks that stretched for several kilometers slowly drove toward the missile base behind the mountain. More than half an hour had passed since the convoy started moving again. However, not long after the convoy started moving, they were forced to stop again. Fuck! Tin Peng, who was sitting in the back seat, cursed angrily. After entering the front line, the nephew of the deputy speaker of the Federation was transferred to Su Li's side as a field commander and liaison soldier. It seemed that because of his identity, the people deliberately let him get close to the leaders of the army so that he would be safer. But in reality, everyone in Group 7 knew that this was not the case. In the few battles that occurred, Su Lo, as the highest military commander, would always appear in the most tense areas and be the last to leave the battlefield. Following behind this young master, not only did they not enjoy the treatment of the leader leaving first, but they also had to bear more dangers. Perhaps it was because of individual differences, perhaps it was because he felt the hostility of the officers in Group 7, or perhaps it was because he thought that they were deliberately torturing him. Tin Peng's mood was not as good as his companions'. On the contrary, he was somewhat depressed. After being blocked for so long, he finally couldn't help but curse. "Shut up!" Su Lu turned around and glanced at him. He took off the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose, and a trace of anger and coldness flashed through his eyes. At the same time, the other people in the car also gave him a fierce stare. Tin Peng was stunned, but he didn't have the courage to refute. Group 7 was a strange team. Other than the direct military orders of the Ministry of Defense, all the rules were. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lee's words. This may be an unspoken rule, but it was an unspoken rule that no one in Group 7 dared to disobey. A lone military vehicle drove in front of the base. The body of the vehicle was old and shabby, and it was not eye-catching. However, including Group 7's fleet, hundreds of military vehicles stopped at the roadside at the same time, quietly and respectfully waiting for this military vehicle to pass. A trace of shock flashed through Tin Peng's eyes. He finally understood why the officers in the car looked at him with that gaze. The probing attack on the Rocky Mountain district began last night. Bai Yulan stared at the military vehicle and said in a calm voice, "More than 300 people died." After saying this, he pushed open the door and walked out. Su Le held his sunglasses tightly and also walked out. Then, everyone walked under the military vehicle and stood on both sides of the road. They took off the military hats on their heads and silently raised their hands in salute. On that lone military vehicle, there was a black coffin that only had a symbolic meaning. With the cruelty of modern interstellar warfare, it was very difficult to preserve the romantic scene of dying in battle. The federal military had always used this kind of simple ceremony to bid farewell to their comrades. The black coffin was covered with a bright Federation military flag. Countless bones were buried on this planet that I am the back of Macho Mountain. Lady Tai turned off the television. She habitually picked up the moist and ancient fragrant agarwood and then put it down. She was silent for a long time. Tonight at the reception on Parliament Mountain, many people secretly cursed President Pabre for deliberately putting on this show in order to obtain political capital, Secretary Shin said calmly. Secretary Shin said calmly, "There are also some people who have made presumptuous comments in private. If His Excellency the President is truly a selfless person, he should throw the Crown Prince to Celine if he has the ability." Thinking of the news she had just received from the front line in the West Woods, Lady Tai's expression changed slightly, revealing a trace of mockery and tiredness. Her only son, who had an incomparably honorable status, had officially resigned from his position as the confidential secretary of the West Woods Commander's Staff Department 7 hours ago. He had landed on the planet's surface and entered the most dangerous Cholene base. The circle that she represented was indeed filled with incompetent fools and fools who had no foresight. However, as the head of the Tai family, she could never completely cut herself off from that circle, because that circle was her circle to begin with. At this moment, Butler Jean quietly walked in from the side and took out a few thin sheets of plant fiber paper. He placed them on the table and said softly, "The Federation Investigation Bureau has sent a message that several very professional people have illegally entered the West Woods from Bermuda. Their target may be Su Lo." Lady Tai's expression was calm. She did not even look at the file. Instead, she directly asked Shinli, "What do you think?" Secretary Shin was a person who was qualified to enter the Trinity Association. He did not spread the bloodshed in the West Woods like Du Shaoqing, nor did he do those terrible things like Shi Qinghai. Since he graduated from No. 1 Hospital, he had been living peacefully in the Xiao Shu Foundation until he was promoted to Lady Tai's confidential secretary a few years ago. When he heard his wife's words, he was slightly stunned. His lips were dry, and he knew that he was finally going to enter the real decision-making circle of the Chinchur Tai family. After a moment of silence, Secretary Shin seriously replied, "At this time, the people who dare to have the idea of killing Su Lu must be crazy but powerful. Su Lu has offended many people, but within this circle, it should be Nan Mingxiu, Lin Dohai, Zhong Ziki, and Li Shuzhu. The eldest son of the Li family has been very quiet recently." Butler Jean said in an old voice, "Even after the scandal about Jian Shuai came out, he did not do anything strange. After the presidential election, Li Shuzhu has become more honest and has improved a lot. Even if he hates Su Lu to the core, he would not dare to interfere in this matter." Lady Tai looked at the agarwood and gently rubbed her soft fingertips. She said, although the two most useless juniors of the 7 major families and the son of a bumpkin. Although they are a bunch of useless people, they still have a strong background. When their anger is gathered together, it should be able to bring some warmth. She slowly closed her eyes. After a long silence, she sighed and said, even Tai's Yuan could not persuade him. Does this little guy really think that he is the second old man? This kind of stubborn little guy who does not see the big picture and only knows how to ruin things should not exist in this world. Although he rejected the young master, this is after all the president's plan. It has little to do with him. Secretary Shen hesitated for a moment and bravely expressed his opinion. He is the successor chosen by the military god. After the victory of the military operation, he will return to the capital ring. I am afraid that he will face the anger of many people. At this time, if we help him, we are actually helping ourselves. Secretary Shen didn't say it explicitly, but he had clearly expressed the meaning of providing timely help and a rare commodity that could be hoarded. What do you mean by help? He will not appreciate it, and I am not in the mood for it. Lady Tai opened her eyes and looked at the ice lake. With the military's efforts to cultivate him, the news that someone wants to kill him will not be hidden for long. While the old man is alive, I will maintain my respect for him and see what kind of future Sulu will have. Of course, I will not think highly of those stupid young masters, but I am very curious. If someone comes to stroke the tiger's whiskers, what kind of intense reaction will Sulu, this little tiger, have? Of course, the prerequisite is that he can come back alive from the front line. She had seen through the ups and downs of the Federation in the past few decades. She knew very well that anything could happen on the battlefield. A stray bullet or a rock could kill a future famous general of the Federation. During the war between the Federation and the Empire that lasted for many years, how many talented and strong-willed young people like Sulu were mercilessly cut down like countless trees. The madam silently recalled the past. After a moment, she slowly stood up and walked out of the balcony. Chapter 459. Secondly, I'm taking leave today. It's not that I'm tired, it's not that I don't have time. I'm not tired at all today. I even went out to play for a while in the afternoon. I definitely have time to write. Even if I start writing now, I'll definitely be able to write 3,000 words by tonight. It's just that my mood isn't right. In the evening, I drank 2 glasses of wine with my father and chatted for a while. I suddenly remembered that when I was young, I often heard my father talk about his old days as a soldier in Tibet. There's nothing to be sentimental about. It's just that the story of the spy is about to enter a more hot-blooded phase. I can't find the point where I feel that way. My life has been joyful and trivial for too long. I sat in front of the computer for a while. I even thought about spelling with my friends, but I still wrote and deleted it. I have to write well. I have to write something slightly better. I didn't give myself enough psychological preparation at the beginning today. This is a serious problem with my writing attitude recently. I sincerely apologize to everyone. And then there's the most important thing. Ever since I got my license, I've never stopped writing. I've stopped writing countless times. Although it's true that the fatigue of being a middle-aged man has played a major role, when you think about it carefully, it's ultimately because I haven't given myself enough pressure. My attitude isn't correct enough, like what I said earlier. I've said in the past that my work is my interest. It doesn't necessarily have any meaning. It's just to entertain everyone. It's to help you pass the time of your precious or leisurely time. But when you think about it more deeply, life is actually all about using various methods to pass the time. So the method is actually very important. In other words, we writers of stories are also very important in a certain sense. Since it's important, we have to have an attitude towards major events. For example, the 60th anniversary celebration, the Olympics, a house, or a marriage. After clenching my fist for a long time, I hereby solemnly promise to all of you, from tomorrow onwards, until the end, this story of the spy, which I like very much, will never stop writing that I am the past. I've always been a man of my word. Everyone knows that, so I rarely dare to make any promises. The little things under my pajamas are indeed wretched. But since I've made this promise today, I'll naturally fulfill it seriously. I'll use this to correct my attitude, to enjoy my work, and to entertain everyone. Chapter 460. The convoy left the base and passed through the Golden Forest. Everyone got off the vehicles and equipped themselves with individual weapons. They carried light work equipment and entered the long-awaited light battleships. They charged into the clear sky and glided toward the dark red sunset in the distance. They landed in a remote corner of the Rocky Mountain range. Throughout the entire process, Team 7 was silent. The lone military vehicle that entered the base and the black coffin on the vehicle seemed to be still in the eyes of all the members. Their minds were heavy and cold. The high temperature and terrifying destructive power of modern warfare made it difficult for the brave soldiers to keep their dignity intact after death. Most of the soldiers' bodies would not be brought back to the main planet of the West Woods or the capital ring. Instead, they would be buried on these remote planets. This was the usual practice of the federal military. From the marshal to the ordinary soldiers, all the people of the Federation firmly believed that the place where they finally fell and died was the land of the Federation. After leaving the light battleship, the 100 or so people rested for a while. Then, they began to follow the mission details they had just received. Under the cover of the twilight, they walked toward a deep valley in the Rocky Mountain range. A slightly strange atmosphere still shrouded the silent Team 7. Along the way, only the sound of military boots stepping on fallen leaves and the soft chirping of birds and insects could be heard. Shiping carried the heavy workbench and followed the team with difficulty. His gaze passed through the transparent infantry helmet and fell on Su Li's back. After staying on the front lines for so many days, he could already erase the cold arrogance and tyrannical attitude of the speaker's son. However, he still kept a lot of it in his bones. But for some reason, when he looked at Su Li now, it was very difficult to summon the hatred that could spontaneously arise at any time. There was indeed nothing to hate. In these days of missions and battles, Su Li had kept his promise and always stood in the most dangerous place. Thinking of the black coffin ceremony he saw on the road, Shipeng's expression became slightly solemn. The troops had a probing attack last night, and hundreds of comrades had died. Compared to the field troops, Team 7, who had not lost a single person until today, was really very relaxed and lucky. Because of the military vehicle and the black coffin, there were many new recruits who felt emotional and inferior like Shipeng. That was why the team in the valley was so silent and calm. Su Li turned his head to look at his teammates at the woodlands. He noticed that many of them were breathing heavily, but their expressions were more relaxed. He couldn't help but feel a little more relaxed. After going through 10 days of brutal training in the West Woods military camp, these guys also knew that they had taken the initiative to train more in the past 2 months. Their military qualities had improved a lot. These young men who were still young soldiers 2 months ago could now carry the technical components of the Bureau of Proclamation that weighed dozens of kilograms and march for 1.5 hours on foot. This kind of progress not only won the silent praise of the veterans, but would also become a beautiful memory in their own lives in the future. The temporary resting area was a gentle slope with trees covering the top. The sunset on the horizon had long been blocked by the mountains, and the world was filled with a slightly gloomy atmosphere. Su Li knew why such a remote place would become one of the areas selected by the Bureau of Proclamation to reconstruct the surveillance network. No matter whether it was in terms of geography or the military arrangements between the Federation and the Empire, this should be a forgotten area. The only exception was the simple and ancient road by the woodlands that seemed to explain some problems. Curly Hair just gave us the details of the mission at the top level. Gu Shifeng walked over and picked up the mini electronic booklet. 284, 822. 13 square kilometers of the axis to lay a network over a 7.3 square kilometer area. It's a Type 3 composite surveillance network. It won't be difficult to install it, but the key is that there are a few spots that might need to be installed on the rock walls. Just treat it as a vacation. Lon Xiaolong held a cigarette in his mouth and shrugged. In this kind of place where birds don't shit, even if we go rock climbing naked, the Empire's patrolling soldiers probably won't see us. No one paid him any attention. Bai Yulan took the electronic booklet from Gu Shifeng's hands. A second ago, Shiping had quickly turned on the workbench and then obediently retreated to the woodlands in the distance. Only Su Lu, Bai Yulan, and a few others were qualified to access the specific mission details of the Bureau of Proclamation's 7 groups of soldiers. He wasn't included. The electronic booklet was connected to the workbench. Su Lu and the others huddled together and looked at the display on the screen. They couldn't help but furrow their brows. It wasn't because the mission today was too heavy or because they had to take risks behind enemy lines. On the contrary, it was because the mission this time was so simple and easy that it didn't seem to require all 7 groups to be mobilized. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the flashing dots on the screen. His finger tapped lightly to enlarge the field of view of the map. At the same time, he silently moved the fixed areas of the previous missions that he had stored in his mind through the back door. He gradually outlined a more complete map. It was indeed the back door. After every mission, the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation would destroy all the records left on the workbench of 7 groups. The complicated data couldn't be remembered through the human brain. Su Lu went through the back door through the old man. He used the first sequence authority that he didn't even understand to ask the central computer in the distant capital ring to send the data back through the back door of the chip behind his neck. Just now, they said that the general attack should be within a week. I think it will be earlier than we thought. He pursed his dry lips and forced a smile as he voiced his judgment. In fact, the Federal Army had already gained an overall advantage on Planet 5460. On Planet 163, they had also begun to take the initiative. However, it was said that on Planet 3320, the troops of both sides were still fighting fiercely. It's been more than 2 months. There are many teams like 7 groups on this planet. I've calculated carefully. At least 70% of the surface area has been successfully rebuilt. But why hasn't the charter been used in the recent military operations? Lon Xiaolong said with a frown. Su Lu glanced at the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation who were smoking silently by the rock in the distance and said, if the electronic surveillance network is used in a small-scale battle, the people of the Imperium will monitor it. As long as the location of the equipment we buried is confirmed, they will destroy it at all costs. The idea of the Ministry of Defense and the Bureau of Proclamation is very simple. They will slowly arrange the net neatly and fully activate it during the general attack. He smiled, held the cigarette in his mouth, and ignited the windproof lighter with a snap. There was a slight light in the dark mountain forest. When the time comes, the Bureau of Proclamation will say, "Let there be light." Then this planet will have light, and the evil ghosts of the Imperium will die when they see the light. In the last twilight, in the beginning of the night, between the slightly bald cliffs on both sides of an old road, the faint sound of drilling machines could be heard from time to time. Rocks were drilled away, soil was turned over, and trees were cut down. In the distance and near, if one looked carefully with the naked eye, one could see many Federation soldiers in colorful military uniforms silently but quickly. They were installing the electronic equipment of the Bureau of Proclamation, which was originally as strange as a monster but was now as familiar as a first love, into this 7-square-kilometer area. The infantry suits on them had an automatic cooling camouflage effect. They could effectively hide from the Imperial Expeditionary Force's high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that rarely escaped Federation's destruction. The team members were divided into many groups. They meticulously carried out the installation work in the cliffs, valleys, and forests according to the complicated and even tedious requirements of the Bureau of Proclamation. At the outermost edge of the mission operation area, Xiong Linquan and a few other veterans were leading Yan Bingyan and the others. They vigilantly watched the movements in the distance. At the same time, they continuously sent out folding signal interference through the equipment to block the signal that might overflow later. Su Lu sat under a large rock. With his sharp eyesight, he observed the image of the team members working furthest away. His fingers occasionally lit up the dense steel windproof lighter in his hand. In the legends of the military camp, many veterans had their heads blown off by the Imperium snipers because they lit up cigarettes at night. However, the Federation soldiers, including him, did not seem to believe in this legend. This was because this was a war that started within the Federation. The Federation had the absolute advantage in this war. All the mission operation areas were filtered countless times by high-altitude satellites to eliminate most of the dangers. Done. Prepare to debug. Gu Shifeng's calm voice sounded in his earpiece. At the same time, the curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official not far away turned on his mini workstation. Today's mission was completed very easily. Su Lu patted his butt and stood up. He looked at the team members who were busy with debugging and physical concealment work. He took a deep breath and realized that it was already midnight. At this moment, he suddenly remembered that year 68 of the constitutional calendar had already ended a few days ago. Right now, he was standing in the spring of year 69 of the constitutional calendar, in a place incomparably far away from his hometown, when the troops returned to the safe zone transit base in the light battleship. Su Lu had just started to feel a faint sense of homesickness when he was successfully turned into silence by an email from his second hometown, S1. This was an email that the Internal Affairs Department of the Federation of Defense had specially forwarded to him. The email said in a serious tone that 2 exceptionally fierce and powerful experts had snuck into the West Woods in the 100 Moose Star region. After a serious investigation, the Bureau of Investigation of the Federation determined that the target of these 2 experts was most likely him. Experts were naturally experts in killing people. Su Lu silently finished reading the email and then destroyed it. The powerful departments of the government were currently investigating this matter, but he knew very well that the people in the Federation who wanted to kill him and dared to kill him definitely had a way to help the 2 experts find a way to exist in the Federation. Although the only loopholes in the glory of the Charter were the uncle and himself to this day, those who lived in Bermuda did not necessarily have no chips behind their necks. Someone wanted to assassinate him, but Su Lu did not have a trace of fear in his heart. During the war, it was impossible for the 2 supposedly very powerful killers to enter the military camp and come to his side. The strength of the military and the professionalism of the Bureau of Investigation of the Federation were his safety barrier. Group 7 was a group of experts who were used to killing and arson. With a delicate man like Bai Yulan and a dozen or so men by his side, even the most powerful killers would pale in comparison. Most importantly, Su Lu had to admit without humility that it was very difficult to kill someone like him. But when he thought about how he had risked his life for the Federation on the front lines, and how there were still some big shots behind the scenes who wanted to kill him, this feeling did not make him sad, but angry. What made him angrier was what happened next. Chapter 461. It was 6 in the morning, and the white willow trees on the horizon were beginning to fill the sky. Most of the world was still in darkness. The Federation's lightest feather model warship, which was still incomparably large compared to a human's body, blocked out the daylight and sunk the darkness, reflecting Su Li's unconcealed anger on his face. The Bureau of Proclamation had unimaginable high-level authority, even on the battlefield. This mysterious organization had assigned Group 7 a new mission. From a certain perspective, it was a military order. As a soldier, Su Li had no reason to refuse, let alone be angry. However, after a night of high-intensity network installation, the members of Group 7 were already quite tired, and they hadn't made any preparations for the Bureau of Proclamation's sudden mission. In addition, it was already daylight, so the new mission would have to be carried out during the day. The level of danger would increase by a lot, and there might be serious casualties. And from the cold attitude of this curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official, it was obvious that he didn't care about the lives of his team members, so Su Li's anger was undisguised in his eyes. The curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official ignored the anger on Su Li's face. He took out a miniature workbench from his black overalls, opened a top-secret electronic map, and said coldly, "The time of the general attack is set for this evening. The installation of the electronic surveillance network has been basically completed. Your mission is to head to the central junction and carry out the final test of the net-like data connection." Su Li didn't reply. He slowly put his hands behind his back, and his straight, thick eyebrows raised slightly, but he stubbornly refused to say a word. The central junction is at 832. 113:47. It will take 1 hour, 12 minutes, and 34 seconds to get there from the central base. I request that you complete the final test mission before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Under the shadow of the warship, only the two of them were there. The soldiers of Group 7 looked at them from afar, and their eyes gradually became suspicious. The officer from the Bureau of Proclamation could clearly sense the conflicting emotions hidden in the silence of the lieutenant colonel in front of him, but he did not care. He lowered his head and quickly demonstrated the operations that Group 7 would need to perform later. In his opinion, he was only representing the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense to issue orders, and all military personnel had to obey orders. Su Li looked at him and suddenly said, "Fuck you, the most advanced technological civilization in the entire universe. Do you still need someone to personally activate it? Although I'm not a technical officer of the Bureau of Proclamation, don't forget that I'm still an engineer from Nutshell, not a university graduate from liberal arts." The official was slightly startled. He slowly raised his head and looked at Su Li's face. Only then did he remember the background of the officer in front of him. His heart twitched a little. An unnatural smile appeared on his face as he explained, "The glory of the Charter has returned to the fallen star. Of course, it is impossible to manually activate it. However, before the final activation, a certain operation needs to be performed." Su Li didn't answer. He just looked at him coldly. After a moment of silence, the curly-haired officer forced a smile and said, "You understand." If it wasn't for the fact that Su Li had several backers behind him, all of whom were the most magnificent scenery in the Federation, a high-ranking officer from the Bureau of Proclamation would never speak softly like this and take a step back. However, Su Li didn't appreciate his kindness. He stared into his eyes with a serious expression and scolded softly, "What do you know? Don't tell me you still expect this young master to leave you an email address so you can send me a few pornographic videos. Group 7 will definitely accept the mission, but you have to tell me the truth." Su Li's voice was full of undisguised oppression and threat. Although he didn't know what would happen to him after the war if he didn't tell him the truth, for some reason, this Bureau of Proclamation official really did open his mouth after a moment of silence. Since the end of the last Great War, the Bureau of Proclamation hasn't carried out any work of laying a network on the surface for more than 10 years. In particular, the installation of a network that covers the entire surface of a planet like 163 and 3320 is something that hasn't been done in several hundred years. The officer said with a trace of awkwardness and silence, although the Bureau has a complete installation manual, there was still a problem. What problem? Sulu asked nervously with a slightly hoarse voice. Last night, when the command ship and the Bureau of Proclamation were doing signal debugging, they discovered that there might be a data error in the linked chipset installed at the central junction. The officer saw Su Li's expression become extremely ugly and immediately continued to explain, but the Bureau has already given me full authority. The relevant technical operation procedures and important parameters are all on the workbench. We only need to carry out some repair work. It won't be difficult. Su Li's expression gradually returned to normal, but he couldn't stop sucking in cold air inwardly. The Federation had already decided to launch a general attack on the planet today, but the most important all-around surveillance and command network was in danger of not being able to be activated. The date of the general attack involved many complicated aspects such as command, combat force deployment, logistics planning, and many others. If the date was changed or delayed, not to mention whether the Empire would find out, the self-destruction of the huge project of war would cause the Federal Army to pay an even heavier price. He took off his sunglasses and rubbed his aching forehead. He looked at the high-end workbench in the officer's hand and said, "Give me the operation specifications and parameters." "No, this is top-secret data. Only I can keep it." Once it involved the regulations related to the charter, the curly-haired officer returned to his rigid and unyielding attitude. Sulu was silent for a moment. He knew that there was no point in arguing over this matter. He gave Bai Yulan, who was under the shadow of the battleship, a look. The next moment, Bai Yulan, Lan Xiaolong, and the other officers of Group 7 gathered around Sulu. Everyone gathered around the workbench and listened carefully to the mission description given by the Bureau of Proclamation official. Everyone's expression became more and more serious. Sulu didn't look at them. He put on his sunglasses again and stood outside the crowd with his eyes closed. He looked like he was resting, but in fact, he was secretly communicating with the old man to confirm whether what the Bureau of Proclamation said was true. In the end, he received confirmation from the flashing light in his left eye. Without any hesitation, Group 7, who were filled with astonishment and anger at the noble and mysterious Bureau of Proclamation for making such a childish mistake, boarded the battleship again and headed toward the target area. Before leaving, Sulu asked the Bureau of Proclamation official a question. "Why Group 7? The Bureau of Proclamation official replied, "The Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense only trust you and your team." The bright sun was suspended above the bright atmosphere. The silent soldiers who were carefully advancing along the outer edge of the smooth river kept wiping the sweat from their foreheads. The team was deliberately stretched into a long line like a gray snake. Under Su Li's request, the team members who were carrying out the last mission before the Federation's general attack were reduced to 40 people. The rest of the recruits were led by Lan Xiaolong and returned to the base. "Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, thank you for supporting our work." The curly-haired Bureau of Proclamation official had already unbuttoned his collar. He stood beside a smooth rock and said seriously, but his hand was tightly holding the top-secret workbench. He absolutely refused to put it down. Sulu didn't pay attention to him. He frowned to prevent the sweat from seeping into his eyes. He cautiously scanned the surroundings. He felt that both sides of the river were too quiet at the moment. He didn't know if it was because the sun was too hot, but there were no traces of animals. A dozen steps away, Xiao Shisan and Da Vinci were using their eyes to ask if they could smoke. However, their leader didn't light the cigarette between his lips for a moment, so they couldn't make any unnecessary movements. The cigarette between Su Li's lips swayed up and down, but he didn't light it. This was the best time to have a good line of sight. No one could estimate the risk of maneuvering along the river. Lieutenant Colonel Sue, my surname is Sia. My name is. The Bureau of Proclamation official seemed to want to ease the tension between himself and Group 7. I don't want to know your name. Sue took the cigarette from his lips and stuffed it into his pocket. He looked at the other party and said directly. The curly-haired official was slightly stunned. An unnatural smile appeared on his face, but then his smile disappeared. This was because a white bird flew out of the riverside forest in front of them. Group 7 immediately became alert. The white bird landed on the shallow sand of the river as if there was no one around. It began to peck at the food with its head lowered. It ignored the scorching sun and ate to its heart's content. No wonder the bird's body looked a little bloated. The members of Group 7 relaxed. They found this rare moment of leisure and smiled as they watched this scene. The Bureau of Proclamation official awkwardly wiped the sweat on his forehead. He was about to turn around and say something to Sue Lu. At this moment, Sue Li's pupils suddenly shrank. He suddenly reached out and tried to push the official to the ground. His movements were fast, but he was still too slow. An invisible killing bullet flew from afar. It cut through the air and hit the chest of the Bureau of Proclamation official. Then, a fierce rain of bullets hit his body accurately and terrifyingly. Together with the workbench in his hand that contained extremely important data, this body of flesh and blood was instantly torn apart into countless pieces of flesh and blood, collapsing on the bank of the river. At this time, the dense and terrifying sounds of guns and cannons on both sides of the river rang out, boom. The fierce sound of cannons instantly covered the entire area of the river. Countless amounts of soil were lifted up. The unclear trajectories of the bullets penetrated the hard terrazzo stones and the trees on the riverside. In the scene of flying tree barks and smoke filling the sky, there were members of Group 7 who were hit and fell from time to time. Pieces of their hard bulletproof vests burst out, and the parts that were hit spurted out blood. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Find cover! Spread out in a star formation. A series of fierce orders sounded in the communication system of Group 7's individual helmets. Dozens of members retreated into the forest behind the river as fast as they could. With a poof, Da Vinci, who was charging forward with a pale face, had blood spurting out from his knees. He fell heavily to the ground. Without making a sound, he grabbed the rocks with both hands and tried to crawl away from the dense firepower of the Empire on the other side of the river. Sue Lu hid under a large rock to avoid the rain of bullets above his head. He didn't notice that his left arm had been shot to the left. He only stared at the body of the official not far away. Chapter 462. The sky was filled with guns and cannons. Countless bullets hit the boulder, splashing countless sharp shards that scattered like flowers. Sue Lu hugged his gun and leaned against the boulder. His eyes looked at the forest diagonally above him. It seemed like he was ignoring the whistling bullets that were extremely close to him, as if he was on a small boat cruising through the waves. In reality, his body was already tense. Then, he inserted the black wire on his left wrist into the back cover of the Cayenne light machine. Almost at the same time, his left hand that was holding the gun shook, and the Cayenne bent down in the middle. After aiming the barrel at the boulder, the scene on the riverbank appeared on the helmet's holographic screen through the optical fiber. Tut tut tut. The Cayenne next to the boulder spat out flames and shot toward the opposite side of the river. However, a moment later, his right hand shook violently, and the semi-metal gun that he was holding was shattered by the Empire's gunfire. The boulder behind him was also shaking non-stop, and the tremors made his back feel numb. It was not hard to imagine how powerful the Empire's firepower was. Amidst the smoke and the mournful sound of the rain of bullets, he said something loudly into the communication system. From the corner of his eyes, he couldn't help but glance at the mangled body not far from the boulder. The official was already dead. He still didn't know his name. Right now, he could only see the curly hair that was plastered in blood. Su quickly made his own judgment. This couldn't be an ambush set by the Empire because the enemy couldn't have predicted that this was a top-secret mission for the Bureau of Proclamation. However, the enemy's firepower was so strong that they didn't know how many people were on the other side of the river. It could only be said that Team 7's luck was extremely bad. Looking at the tattered miniature workbench next to the Bureau of Proclamation official's body, he made the most important judgment in annoyance. The charter network repair data inside was useless. 32 degrees west. Bai Yulan's voice rang out in the battlefield system. His voice was still calm, but he spoke much faster than usual. Faced with the sudden and violent firepower of the Empire, Group 7 was instantly stunned. However, the veterans and the well-trained new recruits reacted in the most professional manner. In the shortest amount of time, they found cover that was reliable and unreliable. As they dodged, they began to counterattack. However, at this moment, several members had already fallen by the riverbank. Terrifying gunshots rang out continuously on both sides of the riverbank. Occasionally, tree trunks would be hit, emitting a trail of smoke and countless pieces of hard bark. Da Vinci fell into the sand beside the riverbank. His left knee was hit, and he tried his best to use his elbow to crawl to the side of the forest. Whoosh whoosh. Amidst the crisp but monotonous gunshots, there were bullets that brushed past his body from time to time. White spots appeared on the round rocks and then exploded. The shrapnel began to jump irregularly. In just an instant, there were a few more holes in his hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and there were a few more bloody holes in his legs. Da Vinci's eyes widened as he looked at the forest that was right in front of him, yet seemed so far away. It represented temporary safety, and a strong sense of unwillingness and fear rose in his heart. He used his hands to grab the sand, elbows to the hard rocks, and crawled desperately, but he was suppressed by the rain of bullets on the other side of the river. His facial features became pale and distorted due to the pain, but this son of the governor of Shisha state clenched his teeth and didn't make a sound. He bravely and valiantly remained silent, unwilling to distract his comrades who were organizing a counterattack. Su Li's face was also very pale, but his eyes were very bright, brighter and brighter. This was because he realized that he and his team had entered a desperate situation. In the distant forest, there were shadows moving. It should be the Empire's soldiers who had crossed the riverbank from downstream and were preparing to flank their escape route. A fierce expression flashed across his face that was full of smoke and dust. He fiercely tore off the data cable connected to the back of the Cayenne machine gun. With a click, he mechanically loaded the gun and pulled the trigger. Amidst the bursts of gunfire, leaves flew up and shadows fell. Just as Su Li had predicted, the desperate battle by the riverbank was not an ambush by the Empire. Since the beginning of the war between the Federation and the Empire, Planet 163 had always maintained a large scale of peace. However, the Empire's people could clearly smell the sinister and terrifying smell under the peace. Especially in the past few days. The glory of the Charter was like a noose. Although they couldn't see where this black noose would land, they could feel that this noose was getting tighter and tighter. On this planet, there were dozens of teams like Group 7. They abandoned heavy equipment that could expose their location and silently and cautiously carried out the surveillance network repair work like ants. How could the Imperial Expeditionary Force not notice and be vigilant? It was just that they couldn't find these guys who suddenly appeared and disappeared like wandering souls. The Empire's soldiers wanted to know where the damn surveillance equipment was, but the Federation had never activated it. Fortunately, they had soldiers who were not afraid of death and were not afraid of hard work, so they used the simplest and most primitive method, which was the human wave tactic. On both sides of the Rocky Mountains that span the north and south of the planet, the Imperial Expeditionary Force sent out countless small teams to the dangerous forests, rivers, and plains. It was like gambling with their lives, and they hoped that they could win this gamble. During this process, most of the Empire's teams either waited for more than 10 days and nights until their supplies were exhausted, or they were discovered by the Federal Army and attacked to death. However, the Empire's team by the riverbank was obviously luckier. They just waited there helplessly, but who knew that they would really encounter a Federation team, and this team had an official from the Bureau of Proclamation. How could they let go of such a good opportunity? After half a minute of silence, the Empire's mobile mountain grenades started to bombard again. The ground on the riverbank began to tremble, and the loud noise almost covered the command and the communication system. Broken limbs flew on the sand, and explosions sounded in the forest from time to time. The dry leaves under the hot sun began to burn vigorously. Screams of Group 7's team members could be heard occasionally in the forest, and the counterattack gunshots kept ringing. A team of Empire soldiers was approaching from the forest downstream, and Group 7 was in danger of being pincered from the front and back. A sharp beeping sound rang in the earpiece. Fortunately, there was no mission area at this time, so the signal connection was not cut off. Group 7 had been desperately calling for air support from the Federation. After killing the two closest soldiers of the Imperium and suppressing the soldiers of the Imperium downstream with the firepower on the right, Sulu breathed quickly and leaned against the trembling rock again. Feeling the numbness on his back, he lowered his head and began to count seriously. 7, 6, he was calculating the firing interval of the Empire's sharp Rabbit Mountain cannon. As a professional engineer, he had been on the front line for a long time and learned a lot from the old members of Group 7. When he heard the sound of the Empire's cannon and the bullet tracks, he confirmed the model of the enemy's main firepower. When he counted down to 3, his pupils suddenly shrank. He knew that this was the time, so he shouted into the communication device, "Big Bear. West 32, look up 3 degrees and shoot horizontally." Almost at the same time, Magnolia's voice quickly added, 15 degrees to the left and right. In the woods on this side of the river bank, there was a sudden burst of popping sounds. A burst of bright flames, like a shooting star, tore through the air in this area, carrying the smell of burning and death, and blasted into the dense woods on the other side of the river bank. Dairin's autocannon finally unleashed its might. Within a 50-meter radius of the forest opposite the river, countless trees cracked and crumbled, slowly falling down. Those ferocious bullets exploded with a loud bang, like white clouds of smoke. These clouds of smoke swept from left to right, forming a straight white line. The firepower on the other side was instantly suppressed by this fierce barrage. Who knew how many Empire soldiers were torn apart and turned into flesh and blood? Just the heavy trees that fell and burst apart crushed more than 10 Empire soldiers to death. Xiong Linquan crouched behind a horizontal tree in the forest, his eyes wide open. His entire body trembled along with the vibration of Dalin's autocannon. However, his powerful arm strength and shooting ability allowed Dalin's 6 lines of fire to not deviate from the direction that Su Lu and Magnolia were pointing at. The 3 old members of Group 7 crouched beside him, quickly and continuously supplying the chain magazine. At the same time, they used their own bodies to protect Xiong Linquan's safety. From time to time, stray bullets would hit their helmets or bodies, causing them to tremble. However, in the next moment, they would fearlessly crouch back up and continue with their work. Their faces were cold and incomparably silent. The firepower of the Empire soldiers on the other side was suppressed. Taking advantage of this short period of time, Su Lu was like a stone. He suddenly shot up from behind the large rock and rushed into the forest. While escaping into the forest, he stretched out his right hand and tightly grabbed onto a wounded soldier that he had been observing for a long time. He brought that person along and quickly left the exposed riverbank. He didn't pay attention to who the wounded soldier was. He only knew that at the beginning, that person had been hit by the Empire's armor-piercing bullets and couldn't move due to his heavy injuries. Using the same simple reason, he escaped the shooting range of the Imperial army like a cheetah and ran into the forest. He didn't notice that his butt had gone numb for a moment. The forest was filled with smoke and gunfire. Sulu stared in the direction of the river bank. He knew that Group 7 had to retreat immediately. However, the problem was that compared to escaping danger, his first priority should be to complete the Bureau of Proclamation's mission. It had nothing to do with repairing or many other things. He was very clear that if Group 7 couldn't complete this mission, then the Federation's reconstruction of the glory of the Charter would have a huge problem. Perhaps the fluttering flag of the Federation wouldn't be able to fly at all. Instead, the black hibiscus flag of the Empire would be dazzling and eye-catching. The person who was carelessly rescued by Sulu was Lu Jiao. She had been shot in the abdomen, and there was a terrifying wound in the blood. He turned around and was about to brace the rain of bullets from the Empire to rescue the wounded soldiers of Group 7. However, in front of him on the right, a veteran arched his body and quickly rushed out. He rushed towards Da Vinci, who was in the sand and didn't dare to raise his head due to the rain of bullets. That person was Xiao Shizenlu. Chapter 463. Seeing Xiao 13th Lu rush out, Sulu immediately stopped and hid behind a large tree. He stretched out his right hand and pressed hard on the bloody wound on Lu Jiao's abdomen. He didn't look at the slightly black blood flowing out from between his fingers. He stared at Lu Jiao's pale face and said loudly, "Hold on." The Imperial troops on the other side of the river were temporarily suppressed by Dairen's rotary autocannon, but the Imperial soldiers coming from downstream finally broke through the line of defense of Group 7. Sulu looked back at the vague figures of the Imperial soldiers at the edge of the forest and felt a chill in his heart. He wasn't the best military commander, but he knew that the only thing Group 7 could do now was to retreat. However, the problem was that they had to retreat cleanly. They couldn't let the Imperial soldiers bite their tails, because Group 7 still had to complete the last mission of the Bureau of Proclamation. If they couldn't fix the stupid mistake of the Bureau of Proclamation, the glory of the Charter wouldn't be able to return to Planet 163. The Federation's general attack that was scheduled to be launched in the evening would have a huge problem. The bright Federation flag might be forced to sleep again. Just as he was thinking of a way to retreat, he suddenly heard Magnolia's angry roar from the forest, 13th. His pupils shrank as he turned his head to look. Xiao 13th Lu's thick legs moved quickly. He bravely rushed to the open area of the river and grabbed Da Vinci, who was in a pool of blood. He turned around and rushed into the forest. However, less than 5 meters away from the edge of the forest, the Imperial soldiers launched a barrage of bullets. Bang! 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 His body was knocked off the ground by the powerful bullets. Just as he was about to lose control in midair, he bravely used his waist and abdomen to throw Da Vinci into the forest. Because of this action, his body was dragged by inertia and turned half a circle in the direction of the river. The bullets hit the hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and a few burnt holes appeared on the military uniform. Bang! 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 A few more Imperial bullets hit his helmet, and the transparent infantry helmet instantly cracked like a spider web. At this time, Xiao 13th Lu was still alive. The members of Group 7 in the forest could even see a trace of a farmer's unique smile with a hint of fear on his pale face. This was the last time everyone saw the farmer's son smile. In the next moment, the high-speed Empire's sharp rabbit grenade exploded in front of his feet. The air around the riverbank suddenly vibrated and exploded. Xiao 13th Lu's strong body was like a cloth bag filled with red paint. He was blown away by the explosion and landed heavily on a huge rock, making a muffled sound. Blood spurted out from his facial orifices and hit the helmet of the infantryman that was about to shatter, spreading along the spiderweb-like cracks. The hard ceramic bulletproof vest was shattered, and the dark military uniform was blown into pieces. The small Federation flag on his left shoulder was cut by the shrapnel and blown away by the flames and air, dancing lightly in the smoke. Then, it landed on his helmet. Inside the blood-soaked helmet, Shao 13th Lu's face still maintained the weird smile from before. His eyes were still wide open, as if he was not dead yet. He was seriously looking at the burnt fragments of the military flag outside the helmet. Skyscraper. Da Vinci, who had fallen heavily on the gravel in the forest, saw this tragic scene not far away as soon as he woke up. He cried and stood up. Dragging his heavily injured left knee, he limped over like a madman. At the same time, he lifted the Cayenne light machine gun with his right hand and madly opened fire at the opposite side of the riverbank. By Magnolia, who was not far from him, kicked him to the ground without hesitation. She dragged the struggling and crying Da Vinci along the uneven ground and quickly retreated into the forest. The imperial royal family's black hibiscus flag was already fluttering on the riverbank. The densely packed imperial soldiers were yelling excitedly as they charged towards Group 7's forest from both the opposite bank and the downstream. Looking at the number of people, it was at least an Empire infantry battalion. Su Le no longer looked at the black hibiscus flag that symbolized death. He also didn't look at the ice-cold bodies of Shao Shizenlu and the other team members who were submerged in the water. He turned around too quickly, and his neck actually hurt a little. He stuffed the first aid kit into the arms of the semi-conscious Lu Jiao and let a passing recruit drag Lu Jiao to the back of the forest. He stood up and shouted at Shi Ping, who had been crouching behind a bush, "Retreat." The gunshots on both sides of the riverbank were too loud. The pale Shi Ping looked at Su Lu absent-mindedly. He did not hear what Su Lu said clearly, but Su Li's command made him suddenly wake up. His whole body trembled. He immediately used the secret battlefield command system and quickly shouted to all the team members, 3 seconds of map transmission. Time synchronization. Regroup at the old location. Everyone, retreat quickly. Blazing plan, cover the rear. The wristwatch beeped lightly. The synchronization before the retreat was completed. According to the orders issued by the higher-ups, the members of Team 7, who were scattered in the riverbank forest, quickly took out the high-efficiency explosives from their waists and threw them at the person who was crouching in the forest. Then, they used silence to suppress their sadness and anger. They carried or supported their injured comrades and quickly retreated to the depths of the mountain behind the forest. Shi Ping did not retreat. As the messenger of Team 7's commander, Su Lu, he had gotten used to his role in the past 2 months. He issued clear orders according to Team 7's battle arrangements. According to his gloominess, cowardice, and selfishness, he should not have stayed. But he felt that his legs were a little heavy today. The lives and blood of too many comrades made his lips dry. The anxious fire in his chest burned his body and made his body tremble slightly. There was a feeling of disdain when he first joined the army that rushed into his brain. "Ah!" He screamed crazily with a trembling voice. He followed behind Su Lu and rushed to the edge of the forest. He raised his gun and fiercely opened fire, killing the Empire soldier who was charging at the front. Su Lu saw Shi Peng's figure from the corner of his eyes. But at this time, he did not have time to express his surprise and admiration. He silently rushed over. Then, his feet were cast in the gap between a big tree and a strange rock. He calmly picked up the 21-26 that by Magnolia just threw at him. Poof, a clear and muffled gunshot sounded. An Empire soldier who rushed into the forest bled between his eyebrows and fell to the ground. He stood next to the tree, holding the rifle level. His eyes were aimed at the optical scope. He quickly panned his view again. Almost at the same time when he moved to his position, his index finger pulled the trigger. Another clear gunshot sounded. Another Empire soldier was knocked to the ground with his limbs facing the sky. Shiping was lying on the rock, howling crazily while spraying bullets with all her might. Su Lo, on the other hand, stood silently and calmly at the front. He didn't look for any cover. He held his long rifle and quickly aimed. Then, he mechanically pulled the trigger. The slender 21-26 long sniper rifle in his hands had become a sharp weapon for close combat. A moment later, 6 Empire soldiers had already died under his gun. He could not retreat. He had to buy time for that guy who had been squatting in the forest and muttering. Only in this way could the army that was retreating deeper into the mountains survive the pursuit of this empire. He did not look like Song Shuo. He was still like that stubborn rock, a rock covered in moss, a rock that had been immersed in the river for hundreds of millions of years. He was not afraid of the Empire's bullets. But was he not afraid? The Empire's soldiers who bravely charged at the front were knocked to the ground. However, more and more Empire soldiers behind them fearlessly charged into the dark forest. In the direction of the river, they could already hear dense shouts and footsteps in the Empire's language. Once the Empire soldiers charged into the forest, it would only take a moment for them to completely devour Su Lo and Shiping. How much longer do we have to hold on? Su Lo held the rifle and fired horizontally. His face was silent. He seemed to be inhumanly calm amidst the smoke, but in reality, only he knew the burning anxiety in his heart. His eyes were already filled with blood red. It was not the blood red of fatigue, but the color left behind by killing. With a click, he knocked down the Empire soldier in front of him. However, a tongue of fire suddenly shot out from the forest in front of him. The rapid bullets hit the tree trunk on the ground, causing Shipeng's left eyebrow to hurt. She subconsciously fell to the ground. The bullets hit the upper half of Su Li's body. It was as if his entire body was forcefully pulled by someone from behind. He slammed violently into a tree 3 meters away. A few more small holes appeared on the hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and a 2-centimeter long wound appeared on the transparent helmet. With a crash, the leaves on the tree were shaken to the ground. Just as the leaves danced in the air, he, who had his back miserably hit the tree, bounced up with an unimaginable reaction and speed. Using the momentum, he returned like a wisp of smoke. His trembling legs left behind a faint trail on the ground, and with a boom, he entered the shrubbery. There was an Empire soldier behind the bush. This Empire soldier with a full beard stared in horror. He could not believe what he had just seen. He clearly had his index finger on the trigger, but he did not have time to pull it down. With a crack, Su Li's palm chopped down like lightning. He avoided the defensive measures and ruthlessly chopped off the soldier's throat. Blood mixed with bone fragments splattered everywhere. The one who had been squatting in the forest the entire time was Gu Shifeng. He was the most outstanding electrical control expert in Group 7, as well as the most ferocious explosives expert and environmental expert. He was squatting on the ground. Of course, he was not helplessly drawing circles because of the cannon fire. Instead, he was collecting the high-efficiency explosives his comrades had thrown to him before they left. His 10 stubby fingers were like the hands of a pianist at this moment. Gu Shifeng only used his left hand to electrically connect the scattered explosives around him. At the same time, his left hand was quickly calculating on the workbench. He calculated the depth of the forest, the angle of the mountain, the thickness of the rock, the hardness of the rock species, and the related mechanical calculations. As he calculated, he habitually muttered to himself. However, today, he did not have the usual carefree and evil smile on his face. There was only a faint haggard and nervousness. There was too little time, so he only had a 30% chance of success. However, this was worth the gamble. Using the shortest amount of time, he completed the installation of the explosives. His left hand's round fingers had just left the electrode when Gu Shifeng hurriedly shouted into the forest, "Go!" Chapter 464. When he heard Gu Shifeng's roar, Su Li's pale face moved slightly. A burst of bullets swept over. In front of the beautiful gunfire, the leaves in front of him were cut into pieces and shrapnel flew everywhere. The Imperial soldiers who had just charged into the forest were all forced to the ground. He released a muffled groan. His military boots dug deep into the earth. The countless pairs of muscle fibers on his legs suddenly collapsed and loosened, erupting with powerful strength. He turned into a gray shadow as he retreated backwards. While he was retreating, his right hand shot out like lightning, grabbing Xipeng's neck. Like a hunter carrying a rabbit, he charged into the gloomy forest. With just a few leaps, his figure already rushed out of the dense forest by the river. Carrying a few slightly curled leaves, he charged like a storm into the rugged mountain rocks, immediately catching up to Gu Shifeng. Fuck! Gu Shifeng, who had already thrown away all of her equipment and even her heavy helmet, looked at the gust of wind that rose around her. She looked at her boss who had passed her. She gasped for breath and cursed. Her fingers spun the wristwatch in a complete circle, and then she suddenly threw herself into a crack on the side of the mountain road. Pooh! An extremely weak explosion sounded from the forest not far below. Immediately after, a second explosion that was slightly louder, a third. In a short second, the 11 bullet burying points between the forest and rock quickly exploded one after another. Like firecrackers, not a single gap was left. In the end, that string of explosions condensed into a fierce and deafening noise. The entire riverbank was shaken up. It was as if a powerful gust of wind had swept up from this place. The dense forest by the riverbank suddenly collapsed, collectively bending over. Some of the thinner tree trunks were even directly blown apart, revealing the fresh but ugly tips of the tree hearts. The crushed rocks that were blown up were like bullets, not distinguishing friend from foe, not distinguishing between friend and foe, shooting in all directions. It was like a torrential rain hitting a wide leaf, making paw-paw sounds. It was unknown how many layers of smoke were scattered, how many layers of bloody earth were penetrated. After an unknown amount of time, the aftershock of the explosion gradually subsided. The cries of countless Imperial soldiers in pain echoed in the woods. 2 burning bodies fell to the ground, twitched a few times, and then stopped moving. Gu Shifeng removed her hands from the back of her head and wiped away the dust on her face. She widened her eyes and quickly swept her gaze down the mountain. After confirming the aftermath of the explosion, a trace of joy and fear appeared in her eyes. She did not notice that the back of her hand was already drenched in blood. It was a hasty explosion, but the explosion produced a perfect result. This kind of luck that he didn't dare to believe before made him sigh with emotion. Were the souls of his companions who had died by the river blessing him? The forest between the rocks in front of them became much sparser, and a sharp whistle faintly sounded. Gu Shifeng lowered her head and used the remaining smoke to quickly climb up. Dozens of meters behind her, the rugged mountain path that was difficult to traverse had already been completely covered by the collapsed rocks. The bullets fired by the Imperial soldiers whistled past the shattered rocks, but they were no longer a threat to the retreating Group 7. The mountain collapsed, fiercely blocking the path of the Imperial soldiers pursuing them. This explosion cut off Group 7's path of retreat, and also left behind the corpses of their comrades by the river. In the battle command room of the Federation battleship in outer space of Planet 163, the situation on the surface of the planet was constantly changing on the huge holographic screen. The senior officers of the Federation were in a hurry, and their expressions were solemn. A sense of urgency like an arrow on a bowstring silently filled the huge space. On the screen, the outer armor bunker of the missile base had already been moved away, and the sharp missile body pointed straight at the sky. The fighter jets on the simple military airport had already slowly taxied out of the hangar and were preparing to enter the runway, ready to take off at any time. Countless heavy armors were silently parked in the valley, waiting for the last shadow of the setting sun to cover their bodies. 350 heavy M52 mechas coldly walked through the forest, startling the birds. There were also dozens of the latest black MX models silently traversing through all kinds of complicated terrain, taking the lead step by step to approach the defense line of the Empire. The Federation's general attack on Planet 163 would begin in full force in the evening. A total of 14 armored divisions would launch a fierce attack from 4 directions. However, at this time, the atmosphere in the command room of the battleship was a bit strange. The generals with golden stars on their shoulders and the young staff officers didn't have much of the excitement before the big battle. They only silently stared at the screen in the middle of the light screen. The surveillance satellite had just transmitted a battle that happened on the 2 sides of an unknown river. The Federation and Empire didn't have many soldiers involved in the battle, and the battle wasn't very intense, but everyone in the hall knew what this battle meant. The deputy commander of the Federation's 1st Military Region, Enchanting, was specially sent from the capital ring to the West Woods to be in charge of the general attack plan on Planet 163 because of the Victory military operation. This highly respected general silently stared at the light screen. His hand didn't habitually stroke his white hair, and his calm facial features didn't reveal any of his true emotions. Even though he had already cursed all the officials of the Bureau of Proclamation and their ancestors in his heart. After closing his eyes and thinking for a moment, he walked into a secret meeting room next to the command room. Looking at the 9 Bureau of Proclamation officials wearing black uniforms, he said in a deep voice, "The team that the Ministry of Defense and you jointly recommended was attacked on the river bank earlier. We haven't been able to contact them for the time being. According to the analysis of the satellite images, the data has been destroyed." The walls of the battleship room made of high-energy plastic mixed with alloy gave off a trace of a cold feeling. The 9 Bureau of Proclamation officials in the room were male and female, but they were all relatively young. When they heard this, they all stood up in shock. Looking at the expressions of these Bureau of Proclamation officials, Deputy Commander Yi's eyes narrowed slightly. He sighed in his heart. Who would have thought that when the Federation's general attack was imminent, the Empire would suddenly go crazy? They didn't care about the loss of lives at all and sent countless guerrilla battalions into the Rocky Mountain region. In the end, it was that team that had extremely bad luck. General, you also know that the Federation hasn't entered a large-scale network like this for many years. I'm not defending the Bureau of Proclamation's mistake, but, since a problem has appeared, we must immediately solve this problem. A female Bureau of Proclamation official said coldly. She had a face that could be considered pretty, but because the outline of her face was too obvious, she appeared a little stiff. Even with a pair of round glasses, there was no way to improve her appearance. This wasn't a defense, but this cold and matter-of-fact tone showed the Bureau of Proclamation's extraordinary position in the Federation structure. Facing an important general of the military, the Bureau of Proclamation official was still so unyielding. Right now, the network is already 86% complete. Once it is activated, this general attack will definitely be victorious. This female official frowned and said, "We need to fix that small problem. The problem right now is that the only team that can make it to that area is that team." She stared into Deputy Commander Yi's eyes and said seriously, "The data is destroyed. We can apply for permission to transmit it again, but that team must continue to move forward and complete the mission." Deputy Commander Yi was silent for a few seconds. He reached out and pulled up the holographic screen on the table. Looking at the video of the previous battle on the screen, he said, "This team has already suffered heavy losses. The 9 Bureau of Proclamation officials in the room didn't say anything. They just looked at him quietly, using this silence to express some kind of firm attitude. A bitter smile appeared on Deputy Commander Yi's lips. As a soldier, he had seen too many Federation soldiers die, but Group 7 was different. In this group that suffered heavy losses, there were many children of important people in the Federation, and that's Sulu. It wasn't that the general didn't dare to take responsibility, but after all, he was a person with feelings, not a cold organization like the Bureau of Proclamation that only followed logic and regulations. Connect me to 3320. I want to talk to Commander Zhong, the general said in a deep voice. A trace of confusion appeared on the face of the Bureau of Proclamation official. He didn't understand why a simple mission would alarm the highest commander on the front line of the West Woods. A moment later, Ning He, the second-class staff officer of the headquarters, walked in quickly and said quickly, Group 7 signal has been connected. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lo wants to talk. Deputy Commander Yi had just finished a call with the Tiger of the West Woods. Hearing this, the corner of his eye twitched. He connected the line and said in a deep voice, report the status of your group. Su Li's hoarse and tired voice sounded from the communication device, 11 dead, 4 seriously injured. Our group is located at 12 bases to the right of the Chichao mountain range. The geographical deviation is 300 meters. We urgently need backup and medical assistance. The screen on the table immediately showed the satellite map of Group 7's location. However, due to the electronic interference of the Empire, the real-time image was a bit blurry. One could only vaguely see some gray rocks and green plants with some black dots scattered in between. Ning He stood quietly behind Deputy Commander Yi. His eyes fell on the screen, but his right hand was clenched tightly behind his back. On that bald mountain were his closest friends and comrades, but now, he couldn't help them. He even had to send them to a more dangerous place. Deputy Commander Yi thought of the previous phone call and the opinion of the Bureau of Proclamation. Without hesitation, he ordered, I order you to continue to the designated operation area to complete the mission. Before entering the signal isolation area, the Bureau of Proclamation will send the relevant data. Please keep the signal channel open. The other side of the communication device was silent for a moment. Then, Su Li's tired and slightly mocking voice sounded again. That's the data of Level 2 clearance. Given the rigidity of the Bureau of Proclamation, will they be able to apply for clearance in time? Hearing this, the expressions of the Bureau of Proclamation officials in the room turned a bit ugly. One of the officials who was constantly exchanging information with the Bureau of Proclamation in the capital ring raised his head and said, there shouldn't be a problem. Everyone in the room sighed in relief. However, at this time, Su Li's tired voice sounded from the communication device again. Many of my people have died. Before Deputy Commander Yi could say anything, the female Bureau of Proclamation official with a poker face pressed the call button and said coldly and forcefully, I don't care how many of your people have died. You must arrive at the designated location in 47 minutes. Chapter 465. The sun was setting. On this planet that was neatly divided into 2 halves by land and sea, the land once again welcomed the beginning of darkness. The low-lying plains were already extremely dark, and only the higher rocky mountain range was still bathed in the redder and redder light of dusk. Probably because of the unique geographical structure of this planet, most of the base points of the charter network that the Federation reconstructed were also set up in the mountains. Between the mountains and giant rocks that were gently brushed by the magnificent dusk, the members of Group 7, who had just escaped death, silently relaxed their tired limbs, enjoying the air without the smell of gunpowder and the environment without flying bullets. However, even though they were resting after being tired and nervous, they still did not let down their guard. They stretched their bodies facing the sky, but they used the rocks next to them to block the detection of the people of the Empire who might be on the other side of the mountain. Almost every member of Group 7 had injuries of varying severity, especially Lu Jiao and a few others who had basically lost the ability to move. If it weren't for the strength of the members of Group 7, it was hard to imagine that they could carry their heavily injured comrades to the top of the mountain. Medical Officer Ho Xiandong had been busy until now. He finally had the time to lower his head and take a sip of water from the water bag on his left elbow. Hearing the sound coming from not far away, he could not help but look up. A trace of confusion and anger flashed in his eyes. The confusion and anger were not directed at Su Lu, but at the officers and the Bureau of Proclamation who were remotely controlling the battlefield from the Bureau of Proclamation. If it weren't for the stupid mistake that the Bureau of Proclamation made, how could Group 7, who had already worked for a whole night, continue to take the risk? Su Lu sat next to a hard gray rock and stared at the satellite phone in his hand. He then glanced at the data cable connecting his watch and the phone to make sure that there was no problem. I don't care how many of you died. You have to get to the designated location in 47 minutes. A woman's voice came from the satellite phone. She said a very bastard sentence. This sentence made Su Li's straight and thick eyebrows frown. Then, he stretched them out in a very indifferent manner. He asked in a low and hoarse voice, "Who are you?" "I'm Deputy Director Bai of the 3rd Department of the Bureau of Proclamation." On the other end of the phone, the female official from the Bureau of Proclamation said in a cold and forceful voice, "Time is tight. You must depart immediately." Su Lu took a deep breath. A trace of suppressed anger could be seen on his cheeks that were covered by black ash. In the twilight, his bright eyes were like a fire burning in the wilderness. As a soldier, a nutshell engineer, and a human being who was closest to the Federal Central Computer, he knew better than anyone how important it was for the Federation to restart the charter network on this fallen planet. In fact, he had accepted the order from the curly-haired official of the Bureau of Proclamation without hesitation in the wee hours of the morning because of this understanding. Su Lu wanted very much to complete this important mission of the Federation, but the losses of Group 7 today were too heavy. The bodies of 13th Floor Zhao's comrades were still soaked in the river, and a few more members had stopped breathing on the mountain road while they were escaping. He was only 22 years old this year. He used to be a young man with integrity, ability, and responsibility. Later, he was molded by the cruel reality of the Federation into a slightly silent, cheerful, and ruthless guy who could no longer trust the law wholeheartedly. He believed in his own judgment more than the law. He was not afraid of killing or being killed. But he was not a qualified commander after all. He could not learn 1/10,000th of the true coldness of people like Du Shaoqing even if he wore sunglasses. He could not treat the loss of every life on the battlefield as a chess piece on the chessboard and temporarily leave. Looking at the tired members lying between the rocks, looking at the wounded soldiers who were bandaged and full of the smell of medical glue, looking at the silent and uneasy expressions on their faces, Su Lu could not bear to part with them, so he remained silent. The silence between the limestone peaks made the officials waiting anxiously in the battleship feel a trace of uneasiness and anger. The female official's sharp questioning and urging voice rang out from the satellite phone again. Su Li's fingers gripped the high-strength plastic case of the phone tightly. He did not frown again, but the emotions in his eyes became somewhat indifferent. As the highest commander of Group 7, he had not made an accurate judgment about the current situation, but the rude questioning and urging from space made it difficult for him to calm down. At this critical moment, the encrypted communication between space and the ground was directly covered by a contact request from further away with a higher authority. A deep, calm, and dignified voice came from the other end of the phone. "Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, I am the highest commander of the West Woods Theater of Federation. According to the federal military's plan, tonight's general attack would be launched in the evening." The evening referred to here was the time zone where the diamond-shaped base group on the ground was located. At this time, Group 7 was alone on the rocky peak, enjoying the sunset. In reality, there was still some time before the Federal Army's general attack. At this time, Sulu spoke to the famous West Woods tiger for the first time. Since the autumn of the 65th year of the constitutional calendar, when the ancient bell from the West Woods bombarded Green Hill on the outskirts of Hishi State with its cannons, the black M52 and the uncle and the mecha turned into dust. Then, when he met the cute little girl on the spaceship escaping from Donglin, there were many more hidden connections between him and Commander Zhong of the 4th Military Region of the Federation. It was just that he had never met this powerful overlord, not even through the phone. The members of Group 7 looked tiredly at Sulu not far away. Looking at him silently talking on the phone, they did not know what their team, which had already suffered heavy casualties, would face next. Understood. Understood. Sulu held the satellite phone and answered mechanically. At this time, the wound on his left arm was still bleeding. Because he was worried that the medical glue would affect the battle later, he refused Ho Xiandong's intensive treatment. He only used a white cloth to bandage the wound. The night in the mountains further away was almost full, and the flames in his eyes were extinguished. He said to the big shot on the other end of the satellite phone, "If you believe me, I can try it myself, but my people are still trapped in the mountains. The Empire has sent too many scattered soldiers in the mountains. You must immediately send a helicopter to pick up my people and leave." The person on the other end of the phone was the Supreme Commander of the Federation's Victory military operation. He was just a small lieutenant colonel with hundreds of people under his command and hundreds of guns. The difference in military rank was huge, but at this moment, he was bravely bargaining with the other party. It was unknown what was said on the other end of the phone. After Sulu hung up the phone, he directly put the heavy satellite phone into the military backpack behind him. Then, he took off his watch and exchanged it with Magnolia's watch. "You take these guys and wait here. The higher-ups have promised me that they will send a helicopter to support you in half an hour." Sulu tidied up the tools he needed to bring. He lowered his head and whispered to Magnolia, "The general attack is about to begin. We are the only team that is still trapped in the war zone. It is already good enough that they are willing to send a helicopter." Magnolia looked at him silently. She could easily tell what this little boss was going to do from his movements. She smiled and said, "Why don't you just send a helicopter to repair that base? The Empire is going crazy today. Sending a helicopter is too big of a target. If the enemy finds that important base, the Federation can't bear the risk." Sulu used his fingers to quickly calculate the number of tools he had and casually explained. "You are going crazy, and the headquarters also agrees with you?" Magnolia asked immediately. "It's just some simple repairs. As long as the Bureau of Proclamation can send the data to the ground in time, it shouldn't be a big problem." Sulu raised his head and said, "Today's mission is not to spread the net. It won't make much difference if I go alone with everyone. The problem is that you may run into the Empire's people on the way. That's why I have to go alone. You know how good I am at running away." Sulu smiled. His face was covered in dust, and his teeth were extremely white. "Personal heroism will get you killed." Magnolia took out the empty blue box of 377 cigarettes from his jacket pocket. He subconsciously took out 2 cigarettes, but he suddenly thought of the battlefield record. His fingers that were covered in black dust froze in front of him. Sulu took a cigarette from his fingers and held it between his dry lips. He raised his eyebrows and said seriously, "Promise me that you will bring these guys back alive." Magnolia tore open the cigarette paper and put a pinch of tobacco into his mouth. He moistened it with his saliva and carefully savored the spicy taste. After a moment of silence, he finally nodded. "Big Bear," Sulu called out to Xiong Linquan and tossed the 21-26 sniper rifle over. Xiong Linquan was stunned for a moment. He silently checked the rifle and prepared the ammunition. At this time, the team members on the cliff could vaguely guess what Su Lu was going to do. Their expressions suddenly became stiff. The members of Group 7, regardless of whether they were rookies or veterans, all knew very well what kind of person their commanding officer was. That was why no one stepped forward to persuade him angrily or beg him to stay. They just looked at him quietly. Gu Shifeng came over and helped Su Lu check the satellite phone and military watch. After confirming that there shouldn't be any problems with the data transmission later, he softly said, "If you want to fix these things, you should at least bring me along, right? I'm also an awesome engineer." Su Lu patted him on the shoulder. He suddenly turned his head and squinted his eyes at Magnolia. "If there's a problem, when you go back to the planet, help me do a few things." "What things?" Magnolia listened carefully. "Tell Zhou Yu that Shi Qinghai is not bad. Tell Jian Shuier that I'm sorry, I can't help you with the investigation of Uncle. You don't have to say anything to Tai Yuan. Tell Li Xiaotong to tell Li Wei to be careful over there. Remember to go to Parliament Mountain and tell Zhang Xiameng, she doesn't need my permission to find a man in the future." A very relaxed smile flashed across Su Li's face. He suddenly thought of something and said seriously, "Tell Nan Xiangmei. I also like her. A suicide note is inauspicious." Magnolia carefully chewed the tobacco in her mouth and said emotionally, "I really didn't expect that a stone could become so emotional. Bullshit, I've read a lot of books. I'm full of literature, but I don't want to let you guys know." Su Lu carried his military backpack and picked up the 21-26 long sniper rifle that Xiong Linquan passed to him. He buckled the magazine on his bulletproof vest and waved at his team members. Then, he ran along the slender mountain ridge. Even though he was slightly injured, he was still very fast when he ran. He was like a nimble mountain antelope. With a speed that shocked the members of Group 7, he gradually disappeared into the burning twilight. Chapter 466. The sun had already set in the west, and the thin air was slightly cold, but Su Lu always felt that the air in front of him was so hot. Every time he breathed, his lips would burn and his lungs would hurt. He ran madly through the mountains on the other side, a pained expression flashing across his dusty face from time to time. From afar, he saw a marker on the ground that he remembered in his mind. He saw a few solitary conifers standing there and quickly ran over. Under the pine trees was a pile of fallen leaves, rotten fruit, and rotten matter that had accumulated for countless years. It was very soft. He sat down and slowly calmed his breathing with difficulty. He let the maddening soreness in his body gradually dissipate. At the same time, he confirmed that this was the place he had been searching for through the GPS system on his wristwatch. The valley was dark, and only the branches and leaves at the top of the trees could occasionally reflect a few rays of golden light in the distance. He did not rest at all. He pulled out the military knife from his waist and narrowed his eyes to stare at the weak electronic signal on his wristwatch. He wiped the sweat on his face with his sleeve. His dark face showed the pale color of exhaustion. He still had the dry and ugly cigarette between his lips. His dry lips had already cracked, and the blood oozing out mixed with dust was smeared on the filter. He looked very pathetic. He had never run so recklessly before. This race against time in the Rocky Mountains had drained all of his spirit and strength. What was even more frightening was that the Imperial Expeditionary Force that was originally suppressed by the Federation to the east suddenly mobilized countless troops and searched everywhere in the mountains like crazy. They knew that the Federation was preparing for a big move, but they could not find a clue. They knew that the noose that was the charter network was slowly falling, but they did not know the location of the gallows. The commander and soldiers of the Imperial invaders had already gone crazy. They were like poor women who could not find the ghost in the house and could only hear the ghost howling. They nervously held the scissors and waved wildly in the air, but they could only hit the air. The Imperium had sent out the few remaining reconnaissance aircraft, and the last of the electronic surveillance troops were scattered in the mountain range that pierced through the planet. The final struggle of a dying man was incomparably ferocious. It was this kind of all-out search that made it impossible for the Federation to send out troops to repair the base point again. Sulu, who was like a silent beast walking in the mountains, was a much smaller target, but he still encountered 4 waves of Imperial troops in a row. The Bureau of Proclamation's stupid mistake needed the frontline soldiers to make up for it. If it failed, the Federation's countless days of preparation would be forced to postpone the general attack. Who could bear this responsibility? The problem was that the mission to make up for this mistake was really a damn mission. Suluk should have died today. If it wasn't for the strange and powerful power in his body, he definitely wouldn't have been able to make it to these pine trees alive. In fact, the fact that he was able to make it here alive was mostly due to his luck. The bulletproof vest that was already riddled with holes, and the infantry helmet that was directly thrown into the valley after being shot into pieces, proved this point. In the darkness, Sulu squinted his eyes, which were unusually bright. He didn't have the time to feel the danger and fear of the previous journey. He quickly used his military knife to push away the decaying leaves and entered the control code on the high-strength alloy panel. The physical cover of this base should be the work of another team. Although they were very experienced, they couldn't hide it from his eyes. He even found the target one step earlier than the wristwatch. Taking out all kinds of tools from his military backpack, Sulu took a few deep breaths to calm himself down. He began to operate the complex components that he had never seen before. The satellite phone's light screen flipped through pages of top-secret blueprints at a constant speed. Sulu quietly and quickly followed the blueprints. The mechanical engineering genius that he had shown when he was young, and the skills that Feng Yu had taught him were fully displayed at this moment. The repair tools that seemed more complex than the underground components were as obedient as chopsticks in his hands. The low hum of the motor could be heard from time to time in the quiet forest. With a light click, the core section of the base equipment surrounded by fallen leaves opened. Sulu looked at the exposed chipped circuits in front of him. He looked at the extremely thin channels that glowed with a faint metallic light. He subconsciously put down the tools and touched the bracelet on his left hand that he was so familiar with that he had almost forgotten it. He carefully looked at the level 2 verification chip in the middle of the system. He took out a connector and carefully connected it. He was very clear about the importance of this chip. Although it was far inferior to the chip that he had planned to steal from the Empire, if it was burned by the current, even if he possessed the uncle's soul and his genius brain, there was no way he could fix it in a short time. The other side of the connector was connected to the satellite phone by a data cable. Sulu looked at his watch and waited for the number to jump to a certain predetermined number. Without hesitation, he pressed the phone button and said, "Begin data transmission." In order to prevent the Empire's electronic control forces from monitoring abnormal signals and to ensure the safety of this base point, he only opened communication with the Spaceship Bureau of Proclamation team once every 5 minutes, and the duration of each communication was strictly controlled within 1 minute. The data reception progress bar on the screen slowly moved to the right. It did not take long for it to reach 1/3. Sulu closed his eyes and felt a trace of fatigue and relaxation. After experiencing the battle at the riverbank, the death of his comrades, and running for his life in the forest, he thought that he had enough patience to wait for some things to happen. And from the looks of it, the error in this base point's core was not serious, and the data used to cover it was not large. The communication channel closed and opened again. 21 minutes later, all the data was sent. Next was the technical operation manual. However, Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank because he realized that the transmission speed of the last document was extremely slow. What's going on? Why is it so slow? He asked in a low voice. There was a slight noise in the phone. A slightly panicked female voice replied, "Be patient. It should be, in time. It's just the operation manual. Why is it so slow? Are you stupid enough to package all the documents and send them over? Hurry up and split them." Su Li said angrily. The deputy director of the Bureau of Proclamation, who was far away in the spaceship, became angry. She said coldly, "This is a level 1 document. The network control is only a temporary part of the authorization. We don't have the authorization, so we can't even look at it. Of course, we can't split it. Idiot." Su Li did not have time to curse because the 2 minutes were up. The satellite phone fell into silence, and the progress bar that only moved a little bit froze at the front. He stared at the progress bar, and after a little calculation, he knew how long it would take to finish the transmission of the damn technical manual and complete this damn mission. A cold emotion occupied his heart. Group 7 had sacrificed so much. If they still failed, he would not be able to forgive himself. This kind of depressed emotion made him have the urge to smash the satellite phone on the tree. But in the end, he did not do anything. He just silently fell into deep thought. At this time, an ominous sound faintly came from the forest in the distance. He suddenly got up, put on the night vision goggles and looked into the distance. He vaguely saw a group of Imperial soldiers. At the same time, he heard a series of chattering sounds. This group of Imperial soldiers did not seem to be afraid of exposing their tracks. They were very arrogant, but in fact, it was a kind of last madness before despair. He did not understand the Imperial language, but he knew that the countless ant troops that the Imperial people desperately scattered in the mountains were really effective. What was even more troublesome was that the time of the Federation's attack was approaching step by step. If only the old thing was here. Su Li once again lay back on the ground. Like a biologist observing the daily life of a cave animal, he stared at the motionless progress bar and thought in his heart. It was a pity that the charter network on this fallen star had not been activated yet. Even the lowest level of the monitoring network did not exist. At this time, even if there was an electronic wall that surrounded the bison in the East Forest region, Su Li believed that he could still contact the omnipotent central computer. Thinking of this, a trace of ruthlessness flashed across his tired face. With a whoosh, he took out the spare Serene Farmer energy bar from his backpack and connected it to the satellite phone. It took more than 10 seconds to open the back of the phone. With a few simple wires, Su Li forcibly increased the power of the satellite phone. The message segment forcibly passed through the thick atmosphere and came to the space battleship in space. It opened the channel in reverse and began to contact. At this time, there were still more than 3 minutes before the agreed 5-minute signal annihilation period. On the other side of the phone came the screams of the people on the battleship, and the annoying female official nervously and angrily rebuked, "You will expose your position. I order you to close the channel immediately." Even if Su Li actively closed the channel, the command ship in space could forcibly close the channel. He stared at the phone and said in a calm voice that made people's hearts palpitate, "Keep the channel open. If you close it, I will give up this mission." The other side of the phone fell into silence. The progress bar on the satellite phone slowly increased, but Su Li did not care about this at all. He stared at the phone and silently shouted in his heart, "Old thing, find me." After about a moment, like a star blinking, a white light that appeared in the vision of his left eye. Here. It seemed that in the military satellite phone, there was indeed a verification chip that could monitor the chip of a human. Su Li knew that he had won half the bet. He forcibly suppressed the excitement in his heart and quickly said in his mind, "The problem with the network base points, you check it yourself and then give me the technical manual. Use the fastest way." The Federal Central Computer quickly showed a line of words in his left eye. "This is a top-secret document with Level 1 clearance. You know, I am just a poor computer. Without the authorization of a human, I can't take the initiative to do anything. You said that I have Level 1 clearance. I will authorize you." This seems to work, but the problem is that we haven't seen each other for a long time. Don't you want to talk first? Get lost. Sulu gave a concise and powerful reply with a hint of Zhou Yu's unique charm. In the time it took for a simple conversation, the central computer had completed the work that countless humans could not complete after years of work. It found the reason, intercepted the most concise and correct relevant technical specifications, and transmitted them to the planet's surface through the battleship. The drawing paper and the operation flow were quickly transmitted to the chip behind Su Li's neck through the verification chip in the satellite computer, and then into his brain. Chapter 467. Inside the spaceship. In the room next to the command hall, the Federation officers and members of the Bureau of Proclamation watched the holographic screen and the slow movement of the data bar. They were so shocked by what had just happened that they didn't know what to say. They didn't know who the officer carrying out the mission on the ground was, but in such a tense moment, when the lives of countless Federation soldiers were at stake, that person actually dared to threaten the command center and the Bureau of Proclamation with the threat of terminating the mission. He was truly crazy and deserved to die. I don't care if this officer can survive this time. After the mission is over, he must be punished according to military law. Deputy Director Bai of the Bureau of Proclamation's poker face was flushed with anger as he slammed the table in anger. Su Li's actions had seriously violated military discipline and even the first charter of the Federation, but right now, the big shots on the spaceship had no choice but to accept his threat. They didn't know why Su Li wanted to keep the channel open, but according to the current data transmission speed, such a long transmission time would definitely expose the location of the Bureau of Proclamation's base. The people in the room were silent, nervous, and angry as they guessed what would happen next. They were extremely worried that the network that the Federation spent countless manpower, resources, and time to reconstruct would collapse because of this officer's crazy actions. But right at this moment, another accident happened. With two soft beeps, the blue light of the data transmission device on the table disappeared. The data channel was suddenly cut off by the ground. A cold light flashed through Deputy Director Bai's glasses. He couldn't suppress his anger and said loudly, "What is he trying to do? The progress is only at 13 points. Deputy Commander Yi put his palms on the table and stared at the holographic screen in silence. As an important military officer, he didn't show the anger and helplessness of the Bureau of Proclamation officials, but his mood was just as heavy. Whether or not the Federation's general attack could be launched on time depended on Lieutenant Colonel Su Li on the ground. But right now, this young man that the Federation military had placed high hopes on, unexpectedly cut off the data transmission again. Right at this moment, a burst of enthusiastic cheers suddenly sounded from the command hall outside the door. The cheers were so loud that even the sealed door of the spaceship couldn't block them out. Deputy Commander Yi suddenly straightened his body and looked into the hall through the one-way glass wall. At first glance, his slightly tired eyes suddenly shrank, revealing a trace of unbelievable ecstasy. The Bureau of Proclamation did not know what had happened. They stood up in confusion and walked out of the hall. On the wide holographic screen in the command hall was a precise electronic map of Planet 163. Amidst the ecstatic cheers of the staff officers, a faint white dot of light gradually rose in the eastern 9th district of the Rocky Mountain Range. Then, around this white dot of light, more dots of light lit up. White spots of light appeared in the mountains, plateaus, primeval forests, coastlines, and knee-high grasslands. They gradually spread out and occupied every corner of the map. In the end, they formed an extremely complex ring network that was completely incomprehensible to the human eye. This was a very beautiful process. It was as if a great creator had suddenly created a star, then two stars, until the sky was filled with stars. Their radiance extended far and wide, enveloping all directions. Deputy Commander E calmly looked at the map on the holographic screen and the beautiful network of light dots. His slightly twitching lips revealed his true excitement at this moment. He ordered in a hoarse voice, "Scan from east to west. Do a comprehensive scan." "Yes, sir." The cheers in the command hall stopped. The staff officers operated the workstations in front of them as fast as they could. Following their operation, the images on the planet below the spaceship quickly appeared on the holographic screen one after another. Those images penetrated into the Imperial Expeditionary Forces control area and clearly showed the distribution of military forces and the electronic signal strength of the Empire. The Bureau of Proclamation team standing at the door looked at each other in confusion. Deputy Director Bai especially opened her mouth wide. She was so shocked that she couldn't speak. She couldn't understand how that damn disciplinary officer had completed the mission when the technical manual had not been sent to the ground. What made her and the other Bureau of Proclamation officials feel even more cold was why the monitoring network on the planet had automatically activated before they had even entered the top-secret activation command. The inspection ended very quickly. Deputy Commander E was finally completely relieved. He sat in the big chair in the front of the hall and quickly said, "Send the message to the base and the troops on the ground. Ask the command departments at all levels to immediately synchronize the data. We are ready to begin." "Yes, sir," the staff officers replied. Deputy Commander E took off his military cap and rubbed his white hair that was wet with sweat. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile, "Begin the calculation and draw up the battle plan." A mechanical and electronically synthesized voice sounded in the command hall. "Yes, sir." After decades of being occupied by the Empire's invaders, the glory of the Charter had finally returned to this remote fallen planet. "Actually, what we did was wrong. Although you have the First Order access, you are not the commander of the Federal Army. I always felt that we should wait for the order from the spaceship before activating the monitoring network on the surface. When the Federal Central Computer communicated with Sulu, it was obviously much more talkative than when it was on the spaceship. Sulu had no time to pay attention to the long speech that flashed in his left pupil. Forcing his tired body, he reinstalled the external protection device of the base and then carefully redid the physical disguise. According to the First Order of the Charter, the Federal Central Computer could never perform any direct physical operations. It could only play the role of a server and a tool. But Sulu didn't care about this. He stared at the appointed time on his wristwatch and used his authority to directly order the central computer to activate the monitoring network on the planet. He couldn't see the countless light spots lighting up in the dark sky like the people on the spaceship. He couldn't see the silent information fragments and fierce data streams, but vaguely, he always felt that the air around him had a lot more existence that made him feel warm. After finishing the disguise work under the pine, Sulu gently fanned his cheeks to wake himself up a little. From last night to tonight, the continuous fighting and running, coupled with the wounds on his body, made his body on the verge of exhaustion. The sound of the Woodland Empire's soldiers in the distance became clearer and clearer, and the distance was getting closer and closer. He took a deep breath, picked up the backpack and long sniper beside him, and moved a dozen meters away with difficulty and slowly. It was only a very short crawl forward, but it made his breathing rapid again. The reason he could hold on until now was all because of the magical power in his body. However, at this time, the power was already exhausted. All the injuries and exhaustion seemed to erupt at the same time, making it difficult for him to even move a finger. The final battle. Leaning against the slightly wet bark, he casually grabbed a handful of wet rotten leaves and wiped his face carelessly. Listening to the approaching footsteps of the Empire's soldiers, he converted the despair in his heart into a last-ditch effort. He slowly raised the 21-26 long sniper rifle in his hand, put on the night vision goggles, and aimed in the direction of the soldiers. At this time, a few rows of clear characters appeared in his left eye again. 17 people, no heavy firepower, no strong colonization armor. The 2126 long sniper is the best choice. Su Li's body suddenly stiffened. He suddenly remembered that the old man had already come to this planet. Although the Empire people did not have chips behind their necks, their bodies emitted heat. His eyes became extremely bright. He took off the night vision goggles with trembling fingers, and then found that virtual three-dimensional images from different perspectives quickly flashed in his left eye. In these images, the reddened bodies of the Empire's soldiers were so clear: 32 degrees to the left, 73, 44 meters, same height. Without hesitation, Su Li suddenly raised the long sniper in his hand and aimed in that direction. It was clearly dark in that place, and he could not see anyone, but he still pulled the trigger with force. With a dull click, the long sniper equipped with a silencer sprayed out a fine bullet tail fire, and somewhere in the night, there was the sound of a human body falling heavily, 29 degrees to the left, 74. 21 meters, tilt down. Notifications appeared in his left eye again, and those clear infrared images also provided powerful assistance for his aim. Turning his left arm slightly, still facing the darkness, Su Li pulled the trigger again. Unsurprisingly, another Empire soldier fell to the ground and died. Only now did the small group of Empire soldiers notice the abnormality, but then another person fell to the ground while clutching his bleeding throat. %yen %%yen. The small group of Empire soldiers screamed in fear and scattered in all directions, searching for a place to hide. They did not know how many Federation soldiers were ambushing them, and they did not know how those bullets from the darkness would accurately hit their companions. It was extremely difficult for Su Li to change the shooting position. He was still facing the dark night. Slightly at a loss, he pulled the trigger resolutely. The bullets from the long sniper rifle were like killing intent from the netherworld. They danced in the air, ignoring the fear of the people and mercilessly reaping lives. There was no twilight in the forest, only darkness, but the 3 high moons in the sky illuminated the sky at the same time. Su Li sat on a protruding rock halfway up the mountain and looked up at the night sky. He realized that the night at this time was like a slightly dark day, clearer than the twilight. He did not know if the Federation's choice of a general attack tonight had anything to do with the 3 bright moons, but he felt that the clouds in the sky were exceptionally clear and beautiful. In the forest, all 17 Empire soldiers died under his blind shots, just like in the S2 Foundation building. The killing on the battlefield seemed to have become a game. Until now, he was still a little confused about what had happened, but the feeling of happiness that occupied his entire body and mind made him know how wonderful it was to survive a disaster. Suddenly, the quiet moonlit night was broken by a loud roar. Countless missiles came from the west, dragging a mournful line, and attacked the position of the Imperial Expeditionary Force with incomparable terror. Then, a dense group of Federation fighters appeared in the night sky and attacked with a roar. The Federal Army's attack officially began. Su Li knew that in places where he could not see, there were countless Federation tanks and mechas rumbling and crushing the trembling earth. A trace of true relief flashed across his pale and black cheeks. In the silver moonlight, he turned his head to look at the Empire's position in the east. Looking at the explosions that were like fireworks, he was silent for a long time before softly cursing with a hoarse voice. His body was a little cold. He trembled as he took out a lighter and lit the dry cigarette between his lips that he had been holding for a long time, stained with traces of blood. The spicy smoke poured into his lungs, choking him and making him cough a few times. He could not help but rub his eyes, and then looked at the sky full of bullets and fire, silent. Chapter 468. There was a lot of mud on his rough fingers, and they were a bit wet after he rubbed his eyes. Su Li's lungs hurt. He did not know if it was because the bullets of the Imperium did not penetrate his hard bulletproof vest but broke his ribs. He also did not know if the wetness on his fingers was because of the pain or because of something else. The dry cigarette between his dry lips swayed softly in the night wind. Looking at the trembling cannons in the sky, he asked silently, "You should be calculating the massive data on the command starship, making suggestions, and controlling the overall situation. But instead, you came to chat with a lone ghost like me. Will anything go wrong? I'm everywhere. One of them stopped by your side and saved your life. Are you grateful?" The Federation Central Computer answered the question in a mechanical manner. The latter half of the sentence was boring. Su Li took off the burning cigarette. This inadvertent action cut off a piece of his lip. He frowned in pain and said angrily, "Go to hell." The silver light on the rocks was beautiful, and the night wind was cool. He sat on the rocks alone and watched the magnificent war like a spectator. It was hard for him to feel proud of himself for causing all this. Instead, he felt a bit lonely. Fortunately, there was a boring but interesting program chatting with him. A self-mocking smile appeared on his face. He sighed in his heart. "If you couldn't find me today, I would have been dead. I've always been curious. You should be deep underground in the Bureau of Proclamation. Even if the information passed through the mini twisting hole, it would take at least 2 to 3 minutes to reach you. How could you be so fast?" "I am not afraid of time," the old guy answered philosophically with the light talisman. "I am everywhere I can. Returning to this planet again, I feel that I am full of strength." Su Li had been used to the more and more nonsensical expressions of the supposedly cold central computer. He was never bothered by the state that he could not explain, so he did not feel scared or frustrated. On the contrary, he understood the answer easily. After a moment of silence, he said mockingly, "Won't you be schizophrenic if you have thousands of incarnations?" The fierce battle occupied every inch of land on the east side of the planet. Every second, soldiers fell and died, turning into mindless flesh and ashes. The battle was too intense. Su Li hid alone in the rocky peak until noon the next day. The federal military finally pulled out a combat helicopter and picked him up from the mountain. The loud roar of the helicopter covered the loud question of the pilot. The pale-faced Su Li was half leaning in the cabin full of the smell of engine oil, looking at the mountains and grassland below. The closer they got to the Federation base in the west, the more troops they saw on the ground. Looking down from the sky, countless torrents of steel occupied all the space in their field of vision. They were slowly but firmly pressing toward the territory controlled by the Empire. It was a magnificent sight. The helicopter stopped about 10 kilometers away from the rhombus-shaped base and immediately took off again to join the tense battle. At the airstrip, there were already military vehicles waiting for Su Li. The violently shaking military vehicle drove along the quick-solidifying cement military road toward the base. Along the way, Su Li saw many small troops, like himself, moving against the torrent of large troops and converging toward the base. These small troops were like Group 7, special teams that carried out net-laying work on the planet. Looking at the tanned and haggard faces of his comrades, Su Li quickly recognized that this included most of the combat teams of the 3 major security companies of the Federation. The combat experts of Whitewater, Blackhawk, and Bluebird seemed to have all gathered on this planet. Although these net-laying teams retreated earlier than Group 7, in the end, under the crazy scattered attacks of the Empire, they still suffered heavy casualties. What shocked him was that among these combat teams carrying out dangerous missions, there were also many soldiers in ragged clothes. These soldiers had obviously risked their lives and worked in the Empire's territory for a long time, but they still maintained an upright state of mind. It was just that their firearms and equipment were obviously a bit outdated. His eyes fell on the tattered military uniforms of these soldiers and the somewhat painful formation of wounded soldiers. His eyes narrowed, and his right hand gripped the handle of the military vehicle tightly. The anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain had finally arrived. The military road was filled with the second wave of federal military forces. The Federation soldiers on the armored vehicles and mechas looked at these bumpkins of Green Dragon Mountain with complicated expressions. They knew very well that although these heavily injured troops were retreating toward the base, they were definitely not deserters. On the contrary, they were all warriors worthy of respect. It was just that a few years ago, both sides were sworn enemies, but today, they were comrades in the trenches. For many people in the government forces, it was very difficult for them to adapt to this change. A shout came from who knew where. The soldiers of the main force slowly raised their right hand and saluted the mercenaries of the three major security companies and the anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain. At the same time, they cast looks of trust and gratitude. The military vehicle quickly drove to the front of the barracks. Sulu leaned on the 21-26 long sniper rifle and limped out of the military vehicle with difficulty. He smiled and said a few words to the soldier driving and patted the soldier's shoulder. A member of Group 7 who was the first to retreat in the early morning had been waiting outside the barracks all night. At this time, when he saw Sulu come out of the military vehicle, his face showed a trace of shock and ecstasy. He screamed and rushed into the barracks. "Boss is back." "Really?" A burst of exclamations and footsteps came from Group 7's barracks. Dozens of members rushed out of the barracks at the same time. Except for the members who were seriously injured and were receiving treatment, all of them rushed out to welcome Su Li's return. Even Da Vinci, who was seriously injured in the leg, jumped out with crutches. Sulu grinned and looked at the members in front of him. He wanted to say a few words, but in the end, he didn't say anything. He silently walked forward and handed the rifle to Magnolia. Then he took a whole pack of cigarettes from Lon Xiaolong and opened it. He dragged his injured and tired body and seriously gave cigarettes to each member. After a pack of cigarettes was finished, Zhongzhenzi patted his head and quickly ran into the barracks to take half of the stock and handed it to him. Sulu continued to seriously give cigarettes to each member and then lit them up. At the same time, he sincerely said in a hoarse voice, "You worked hard. You worked hard." Yesterday morning, Lon Xiaolong had led the dozens of new members to retreat first, and their faces were filled with shame and unwillingness. As for the members who had followed Sulu to kill their way to the peak of the green-gray rock, their faces were filled with excitement and excitement. Then, Sulu walked to the somewhat familiar tree next to the barracks. He put 3 cigarettes between his lips and lit them up. He took 2 puffs and seriously inserted them into the loose soil under the tree. Bursts of smoke, there was a deathly silence. Many people's eyes were red. It was not necessarily sadness, but mixed with some kind of complicated emotion. On this planet, Group 7 had not lost a single person for more than 2 months. However, in the last mission before the Great Counterattack, they were ruthlessly slashed by the Imperium. In the river bank and the subsequent retreat, more than 10 of their brothers fell into eternal slumber. In this deathly silent atmosphere, some new members could not help but cry. Immediately, they were fiercely yelled back by their companions. The team members fiercely smoked one cigarette after another, like burning paper rolls between their lips. This was the life of the Empire people. The entire barracks was shrouded in silence and the pungent smell of 37 brand cigarettes. Da Vinci smoked the most fiercely. He silently squatted under the eaves of the barracks. He thought of the big guy who lived in the same room, the farmer's son. He thought of the helmet sprayed with blood on the riverbank. He thought of not being able to smell the smell of that guy's feet in the future. His eyes had long since turned red. There was a hint of viciousness in the scarlet red that was hard to describe. At this time, the camera crew of the Venus documentary film studio of the Ministry of National Defense quietly appeared in the barracks. The buzzing sound of the equipment operating woke up the team members who were immersed in the sad atmosphere. There were only 2 people in the camera crew. Yesterday, they withdrew halfway through the mission, so they did not film the fierce battle on the riverbank. At this time, of course, they did not want to miss the scene that was enough to move all the people of the Federation. Stop filming, Sulut stood up with the help of a tree trunk. He glanced at his left arm that was bleeding and said to the cameraman. The cameraman hesitated and looked at the host next to him. Fuck, I told you to stop filming. Da Vinci stared with his bloodshot eyes and rushed over like a tiger. He kicked the cameraman away, grabbed the camera, and slammed it on the ground, shattering it into pieces. Sulut lowered his head and waved his hand. Lon Xiaolong and Xiong Linquan rushed up and blocked Da Vinci behind them. Bai Yulan used her sharp and cold eyes to force the cameraman and the host out of the barracks. The doctor, Ho Xiandong, shook his head and gave Da Vinci a sedative injection. As veterans of Group 7, they had all experienced the emotions of these rookies when they first encountered life and death. At this time, looking at Da Vinci, who was gradually relaxing and sleeping in their arms, they also felt depressed. The military camp prohibited alcohol and cigarettes. In the face of a life and death situation, soldiers all needed the stimulation of cigarettes. In the legends of the military camp, there was naturally a reference to this. That was, a fire. A fire was a reference to when a soldier woke up early in the morning and went to the toilet. Then, he would light up one cigarette after another and smoke until he went to sleep. In the first 3 days after the mission, Su Lu and many people in Group 7 lived a life that was similar to a fire. The laughter of their dead comrades, the exhaustion after the fierce battle, and the trembling of surviving a disaster could only be slightly relieved by the company of cigarettes. Su Lu also hid a fire in his heart. If it wasn't for the stupid mistake made by the Bureau of Proclamation, Group 7 wouldn't have had to take that last risk. Those men would have been happily chatting in the barracks and smoking like him. Su Lu knew his weakness. If he couldn't avenge his comrades who didn't deserve to die, the fire in his heart would never be extinguished. It would only burn more and more fiercely. However, the opponent was the mysterious and indifferent Bureau of Proclamation. Before he had time to write a report to the Ministry of Defense, the Bureau of Proclamation had found him first. Chapter 469. During the mission to repair the base, Su Lu knew that his actions had violated many military rules. For example, disobeying military orders was a serious offense. Especially when he forcibly went through the underground tunnel to communicate with the base at the end, it was a very serious offense. However, it had been 3 days since he returned to the military camp. The white ash from the cigarette was spread 3 feet under his feet, but the higher-ups of the military did not say anything. He thought that the mission was successfully completed. The higher-ups glanced at the mountains behind him and were ready to leave the matter unsettled. Who would have thought that there was actually a secret investigation targeting him? Interesting. Su Lu began to pack his luggage with a calm expression. He followed the officer from the Bureau of Proclamation and walked out of the barracks. The military vehicle was waiting for him at the gate. The members of Group 7 who had just received the news immediately went into a frenzy. They wore their hats askew, wore military shoes, and had cigarettes in their mouths. They looked like gangsters from Bermuda. They grabbed all kinds of guns and rushed out of the barracks, blocking the military vehicle that was just about to leave. Looking at the black muzzles, the faces of the officers from the Bureau of Proclamation and the military police in the vehicle became extremely ugly. They tried to intimidate them with military rules, but it was to no avail. The members stared at these people with eyes that were about to spit out fire. Although not everyone knew the truth of the last mission, they knew what kind of price Group 7 had paid and how much risk their leader had taken to successfully complete the mission. But in the end, these fucking higher-ups still wanted to investigate. Sulu looked at Bai Yulan through the glass. Bai Yulan understood what he meant. She threw the cigarette butt on the ground and stepped on it to extinguish it. She said to the members blocking the gate in a deep voice, "Are you crazy? Put down your guns." The members looked at each other and slowly put down their guns. However, they still stared at the people in the military vehicle with cold and ruthless expressions. It seemed that if the officers from the Bureau of Proclamation did not immediately let Sulu out, countless bullets would be fired at the vehicle in the next moment. The dark glass slowly fell down. Sulu looked at these people and said, "Disperse. I'll be back in 2 days." Among the new and old members of Group 7, Bai Yulan was the one they had the most interaction with. They were also most in awe of this seemingly unparalleled beauty, but in reality, she was a ruthless and cunning veteran. On the contrary, in the past few months of military life, Sulu did not spend a lot of time with his team members. He spent most of his time buried in his office and rarely worried about the cruel training and the bustling life. He was not like an excellent general who would undress and push food to maintain his authority and degree of respect in the team. What was amazing was that once Sulu spoke, no one in Group 7 dared to disobey him. This was because he had perfectly fulfilled his promise before the battle. As the saying went, charge at the front, retreat at the back. I'll be the scapegoat, but I'll still be the one to face the mountain of knives. He didn't say much, but he did a lot. A commander like this was like a big rock under their buttocks. It was very easy for his team members to feel at ease and trust him completely. So at this time, when Sulu asked everyone to disperse, although the members of Group 7 were very unwilling, they still quickly dispersed and made way for the military vehicle to move forward. Then they fiercely spat countless mouthfuls of thick spittle in the direction of the fleeing military vehicle. Staff Officer Ning, I want to see Deputy Commander E. I don't understand why that officer clearly violated so many military rules, but the command center is still unwilling to come up with specific punishment measures. In my opinion, a rogue officer like this who has no regard for military rules should be removed from our team. Deputy Director Bai of the Bureau of Proclamation adjusted the square glasses on the bridge of her nose. A trace of coldness flashed across her poker face. Her angry voice sounded particularly rigid. Ning he glanced at her and calmly and politely said, "Director Bai, the commander has been in command for 3 consecutive days and is now resting. As for the matter you mentioned, the commander has said that since the Bureau of Proclamation is strongly requesting to investigate this matter, then please investigate thoroughly first before the military takes over." Deputy Director Bai was stunned. Thinking of the infuriating officer in the room and the command center that had always maintained a strange attitude, a trace of anger appeared between her brows. She coldly snorted and turned to leave. Ning he watched her disappear into the corridor and the smile on his face disappeared. He gently knocked on the door and walked into the room. He said to the general beside the wide porthole in a deep voice, "The Bureau of Proclamation's investigation seems to have made no progress. Deputy Director Bai is here again to request for a military discipline review." As a former member of Group 7, Ning he naturally couldn't bear to see Sulu in Group 7 being humiliated and investigated. Although he knew that Sulu in Group 7 had outstanding backgrounds, this investigation was conducted by the Bureau of Proclamation. He was only a mid-rank staff officer and couldn't do more. Deputy Commander Eat slowly turned around with no expression on his face. As one of the big shots in the military, he didn't need to care about this investigation at all. However, since it involved Su Lo and Group 7, he had been maintaining a calm attitude and watching the show. Punishment by military law. The general's face was full of ridicule. Not to mention that Su Lo and Group 7 had completed their mission beautifully. Even if there really was a problem, would there really be anyone in the military who dared to conduct an internal investigation on their own? Deputy Commander E was a little angry at the thought of the fierce battle still going on the planet, and the Bureau of Proclamation couldn't wait to capture their officers back to the warship. But the Bureau of Proclamation's position in the Federation was too high, so he couldn't stop it. After a moment of silence, Deputy Commander E opened his mouth and said, "Keep an eye on the situation in the interrogation room. We must ensure the personal safety of Lieutenant Colonel Su Lo." "What if a conflict arises?" Ning he asked. Deputy Commander E said with slight ridicule, "Of course we'll snatch him and send him back to the capital. Are we going to let him eat with the poker faces of the Bureau of Proclamation?" On the other side was the Bureau of Proclamation, but behind Su Lo was the entire federal military. If both sides were said to be the most powerful thugs in the Federation, then at the end of the line, the thug with the gun would ultimately be more vicious. In the quiet interrogation room, an officer from the Bureau of Proclamation was recording with his head down. Su Lo lowered his head and slowly sipped on his coffee. The investigation team didn't take any coercive measures against him, and they even provided him with delicious coffee. However, after answering countless questions in the past hour, even someone as stoic as him began to feel irritated. The Bureau of Proclamation's investigation was in an awkward situation. Whether it was Su Lo obeying the military order, forcibly opening the communication channel, or something else, this was a matter of military discipline. However, at this moment, the frontline command was not willing to interfere with this investigation at all. Therefore, no matter how Su Lo answered, the Bureau of Proclamation couldn't come to the conclusion they needed. The door was pushed open, and Deputy Director Bai walked in with a sullen face. He slammed the table in front of Su Lo and reprimanded him with a sharp and rigid voice, "You continuously disobeyed military orders. Do you know that at every step, you may have caused irreparable losses?" Su Lo put down his coffee cup, lowered his head and answered in a hoarse voice, "But the fact is that I succeeded. I didn't cause any losses. Have a proper attitude. Raise your head," Deputy Director Bai reprimanded him angrily. Su Lo didn't raise his head. Instead, he picked up his coffee cup again and took a tasteless sip. "I know that you are Minister Zhou's future son-in-law, a reserve military officer that the war god has focused on training." After a moment of silence, Deputy Director Bai said, "I know that you have a powerful background, a powerful backer. I, and all the staff in the Bureau, respect the war god and Minister Zhou very much." The female official's voice was sharp and sarcastic again. "But you have to understand that this is an investigation by the Bureau of Proclamation. I am already being very polite to you because of some important people. Otherwise, I would have already arrested you and all your useless team members a long time ago." Hearing the words, "useless team members," Su Lo suddenly raised his head and stared into the woman's eyes. He knew very well the position of the Bureau of Proclamation in the Federation. If he really offended them, the Bureau of Proclamation didn't need to give face to the military. However, the mockery and contempt in the woman's words towards his team members was something that he couldn't accept. "Do you know why I refuse to raise my head?" He looked at Deputy Director Bai and said, "Because I like to look at girls who wear glasses, but I'm really afraid that I'll vomit when I see this pair of glasses on your ugly pig face." Deputy Director Bai was stunned. Her square face flushed with anger, and her whole body trembled. She pointed at Su Lo but couldn't say anything. Such a low-level personal attack shouldn't have been enough to make her lose her composure, but ever since she started working, she had never met anyone who dared to be so disrespectful to an official of the Bureau of Proclamation. Su-Lu ignored her. He put the coffee cup on the table, stood up, straightened his military uniform, and walked out the door. Stop. You want to go against the investigation. You asked me to help with the investigation, so here I am. Su-Lu turned around to look at her and the stunned Bureau of Proclamation official and said, "You've been asking for so long, and there's nothing wrong. Why should I not leave?" Deputy Director Bai was truly angered by Su-Li's calm and contemptuous attitude. She took a deep breath and ignored the man's background. She said in a low voice, "You opened the channel on your own, and that has already violated the Bureau of Proclamation's rules." Su-Lu interrupted her and said, "Those are the internal rules of the Bureau of Proclamation. I've studied them, so you don't have to scare me. I'm not a member of the Bureau of Proclamation, so these rules can't control me." Is that so? The Bureau of Proclamation would like to know how you managed to activate the surveillance network on the planet. Deputy Director Bai laughed, but there was coldness and viciousness in her smile. "I think it will be difficult for you to explain this question. Maybe you will need to come back to the Bureau of Proclamation with us for a few years to explain." Su-Li's body stiffened. He finally understood why the Bureau of Proclamation officials did not care about the attitude of the Department of Defense in Philadelphia, and why they wanted him on the warship to help with the investigation. An ordinary officer of the Federation had the ability to activate the surveillance network before the Bureau of Proclamation team. This was definitely something that would shock the Bureau of Proclamation. He pondered in silence for a long time, and found that some of the things that he wanted to keep in his mind could not be hidden in the bottom layer of his hard drive forever like porn movies. "My name is Su-Lu. You should have my citizen ID. I suggest you check the authority given to me by the charter." He looked at Deputy Director Bai and said calmly, like the director of the Bureau of Proclamation giving orders to his subordinates. "After you check it, remember to keep it strictly confidential. Only the two of you know my authority level. If the Bureau of Proclamation has any internal investigation, I allow you to report it to Director Bai." Deputy Director Bai definitely did not understand this sentence. She looked at him coldly, as if she was looking at a crazy person. But then, a muffled sound came from behind her. The Bureau of Proclamation official in charge of recording fell to the ground heavily. Out of curiosity, the Bureau of Proclamation official really checked the charter authority of citizen Su-Lu. The official was shocked by the level that appeared on the light screen and lost his ability to move. Deputy Director Bai walked to the workbench uneasily. She took off her glasses and looked at the light screen. Her right hand trembled, and she could no longer hold the legs of the glasses. "You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."